Polar bear devours oil worker on night shift, December 6, 2025. The Arctic wind howled across the frozen wasteland of Alaska's North Slope, carrying with it the promise of death. December had always been unforgiving in this desolate corner of the world, but the winter of 2025 brought something different. Something that would forever change the lives of the men and women working the oil fields near Prudhoe Bay. What began as another routine night shift for the crew at North Star Drilling Platform 7 would end in blood, terror, and a horror so profound that it would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Frank Miller had been working the oil fields for 18 years, ever since his discharge from the army following 2 tours in Afghanistan. At 41, he was considered one of the most experienced roughnecks on the North Slope. A man who had seen everything the Arctic could throw at a human being and had survived it all. Born and raised in Fairbanks, Frank understood the brutal realities of Alaska better than most. His weathered face bore the scars of countless storms, his hands were permanently stained with crude oil, and his steel-grey eyes held the kind of wariness that only came from years of dancing with death in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Frank's wife, Margaret, had been begging him to take a position closer to home for the past 5 years. Their marriage had survived his military deployments, but the extended rotations in the oil fields were wearing on both of them. Their 2 children, Sarah, 16, and Michael, 14, barely knew their father, except through video calls and brief visits between shifts. Margaret worked as a nurse at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, pulling double shifts to supplement Frank's income and fill the lonely hours when he was away. She had grown tired of explaining to neighbors why her husband missed school plays, birthdays, and holidays. But the money was too good to walk away from. Frank's annual salary of $140,000 plus overtime and hazard pay was more than he could make anywhere else with his limited education. The North Star Drilling Platform 7 was located approximately 38 miles northeast of Prudhoe Bay, accessible only by ice road during the winter months or helicopter during the brief summer thaw. The facility consisted of a main drilling tower, several support buildings, a mess hall, sleeping quarters for the crew, and a series of storage sheds containing equipment and emergency supplies. The platform sat on a raised foundation designed to prevent permafrost melting, surrounded by a network of pipes, generators, and monitoring equipment that required constant maintenance even in the most extreme weather conditions. Frank's crew for the December rotation included 11 other men, each bringing their own stories of desperation, ambition, or simply the stubborn refusal to be beaten down by life. The crew chief was Robert "Bobby" Henderson, a 47-year-old veteran of the oil industry who had worked platforms from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Sea before settling into the Arctic operations. Bobby was known for his strict adherence to safety protocols and his ability to keep his men calm during emergencies. He lived in a small apartment in Anchorage with his elderly mother, sending most of his earnings to pay for her medical care following a devastating stroke 3 years earlier. The assistant driller was Carlos Mendoza, a 29-year-old immigrant from Mexico who had worked his way up through the industry with a combination of raw talent and relentless work ethic. Carlos was saving money to bring his wife and 2 young daughters to Alaska, living in a Spartan company dormitory and eating nothing but ramen noodles and canned beans to maximize his savings. His English was still heavily accented, but his mechanical skills were legendary among the crew. James "Jimmy" Patterson served as the mud engineer, responsible for monitoring the drilling fluid that kept the operation running smoothly. At 34, Jimmy was a recovering alcoholic who had found purpose in the demanding, dangerous work of the oil fields. He attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings via video conference every Tuesday and Thursday evening, using the isolation of the platform as a form of self-imposed exile from the temptations of his former life in Seattle. The motorman was David Kim, a recent graduate from the University of Alaska Anchorage with a degree in petroleum engineering. At 25, David was the youngest member of the crew and still learning the practical realities of oil field work. His parents, both doctors in Anchorage, had initially opposed his career choice, preferring that he pursue medicine or law. David was determined to prove himself worthy of respect among the older, more experienced workers. Tommy Kowalski handled equipment maintenance and repair, a 38-year-old former submarine mechanic who had transferred his skills from the Navy to the oil industry. Tommy was known for his ability to jury-rig solutions to mechanical problems using whatever materials were available. He lived alone in a cabin outside Fairbanks, spending his off time hunting and fishing in the Alaska wilderness. The floor-hand positions were filled by Marcus Williams, a 26-year-old former gang member from Detroit who was trying to build a legitimate life after serving 4 years in prison. Steve Johnson, a 42-year-old divorced father of 3 who was working to pay child support and legal fees, and Miguel Santos, a 23-year-old college dropout who was saving money to return to school and complete his engineering degree. The crew's medic was Patricia "Patty" O'Brien, one of only 2 women on the platform. At 31, Patty was a former Army medic who had served 3 tours in Iraq before transitioning to civilian life. She carried herself with military bearing and had earned the respect of her male colleagues through her competence and no-nonsense attitude. Patty was openly gay and had faced discrimination early in her oil field career, but her medical skills made her indispensable to operations on the remote platform. The cook and general support person was Elena Vasquez, a 52-year-old widow who had taken the job to support her aging parents and her youngest daughter's college education. Elena had worked in restaurant kitchens her entire adult life, but had never faced the challenges of preparing meals for a dozen people in sub-zero temperatures, with limited supplies and equipment. Finally, there was the security guard, William Bill Tucker, a 60-year-old former police officer from Anchorage, who had taken the position as a semi-retirement job. Bill was supposed to monitor the perimeter of the facility and ensure that wildlife stayed away from the work areas. His primary concerns were typically Arctic foxes getting into the garbage and the occasional caribou wandering too close to the equipment. He had received basic training on polar bear safety protocols, but in his 3 years on the platform, he had never encountered one of the massive predators. The December 2025 rotation had begun on November 28th, with the crew scheduled to work until December 21st before returning to their families for the holidays. The weather had been particularly harsh even by Arctic standards, with temperatures dropping as low as -48 degrees Fahrenheit and wind speeds reaching 60 miles per hour during the worst storms. The extreme conditions had slowed drilling operations and increased equipment failures, putting additional stress on the crew as they struggled to maintain their production quotas. December 6th started like any other day on the platform. The crew woke at 5:30 a.m. to Elena's announcement over the intercom system, stumbled through the communal bathroom facilities, and gathered in the mess hall for breakfast. The meal consisted of scrambled eggs from powder, bacon that had been frozen and thawed multiple times, hash browns made from dehydrated potatoes, and coffee strong enough to dissolve metal. Outside, the wind was howling at a steady 40 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped to -37 degrees. Frank sat at his usual spot at the far end of the long metal table, methodically eating his breakfast while reviewing the maintenance reports from the previous shift. Bobby Henderson announced that they would be focusing on repairing a hydraulic leak in the drilling assembly and replacing several sections of piping that had developed stress fractures due to the extreme cold. It was dangerous, tedious work that would require the entire crew to work in coordinated teams throughout the day. The morning shift began at 7 a.m. with a safety briefing conducted in the main equipment shed. Bobby went through the standard checklist: weather conditions, equipment status, emergency procedures, and wildlife awareness. Bill Tucker reported that he had seen tracks in the snow around the perimeter fence during his morning patrol, but they appeared to be from Arctic foxes rather than larger predators. The crew nodded along with the familiar routine, most of them barely listening to information they had heard hundreds of times before. Work progressed steadily throughout the morning, despite the challenging conditions. The hydraulic leak required Carlos and Tommy to crawl into the confined space beneath the drilling platform, working with frozen tools while wearing bulky protective gear. Frank and Marcus handled the pipe replacement, using a portable heater to warm each section before installation. David monitored the drilling operation from the control shed, constantly adjusting parameters to maintain optimal pressure and flow rates. Lunch was served at noon: chili made from canned beans and ground beef, cornbread from a mix, and hot chocolate that actually managed to stay warm for more than 5 minutes in the sub-zero conditions. The crew ate quickly, knowing that extended breaks meant equipment would freeze and create additional problems. Elena had developed a remarkable ability to prepare hot, nutritious meals under impossible conditions, earning the gratitude and respect of men who typically took such things for granted. The afternoon brought new challenges as wind speeds increased and visibility dropped due to blowing snow. Bobby made the decision to suspend outdoor work and focus on equipment maintenance that could be performed inside the heated shops. Frank found himself assigned to the parts inventory shed, a relatively warm and quiet task that allowed him to catch up on paperwork and maintenance logs. As evening approached, the crew gathered for dinner: beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread that Eleanor had somehow managed to bake in the primitive kitchen, and coffee that had become the lifeblood of the operation. Conversation was limited, as exhaustion and cold had taken their toll on everyone's energy levels. Most of the men were looking forward to the end of their shift and the chance to get a few hours of sleep before starting the cycle again. The night shift officially began at 8 p.m., with Frank taking over primary responsibility for monitoring the drilling operation, while the rest of the crew handled routine maintenance and equipment checks. The wind had decreased slightly, but the temperature continued to drop, reaching -42 degrees by 9 p.m. Frank settled into the control shed, surrounded by monitors, gauges, and communication equipment that connected him to the drilling operation and the outside world. The control shed was a rectangular building measuring approximately 12 feet by 20 feet, constructed of insulated steel panels and heated by a propane furnace that struggled to maintain a temperature of 50 degrees above zero. 3 large windows provided views of the drilling tower and the surrounding work area, though visibility was limited by the darkness and blowing snow. The interior was cramped with equipment racks, control panels, desk space, and a small break area with a coffee maker and microwave. Frank's responsibilities during the night shift included monitoring drilling parameters, adjusting equipment settings as needed, maintaining communication with the day shift supervisor in Prudhoe Bay, and coordinating with the other crew members performing maintenance tasks throughout the facility. It was demanding work that required constant attention, but Frank had developed the experience and instincts necessary to identify potential problems before they became serious emergencies. At 10:30 p.m., Frank received a radio call from Tommy, who was working on a generator repair in the maintenance shed approximately 100 yards from the control building. Tommy reported that he was having difficulty with a stubborn bolt and requested assistance from Carlos, who had the specialized tools needed for the job. Frank coordinated the crew movements, ensuring that all critical operations remained properly monitored while personnel moved between buildings. The night was darker than usual due to heavy cloud cover that blocked both moonlight and starlight. The only illumination came from the platform's work lights, which created islands of harsh white light, separated by vast areas of impenetrable darkness. The combination of extreme cold, wind, and darkness created an environment that was not only uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous for anyone working outside the heated buildings. At 11:15 p.m., Frank noticed a slight irregularity in the drilling pressure readings that suggested a potential problem with the mud circulation system. He made a series of adjustments to the flow rates and pump speeds, monitoring the results carefully to ensure that the corrections were effective. This type of problem-solving was exactly what Frank enjoyed most about his work. The combination of technical knowledge, experience, and intuition required to keep complex equipment operating under extreme conditions. While Frank focused on the drilling parameters, Bill Tucker was conducting his scheduled perimeter patrol, walking the fence line that surrounded the facility and checking for any signs of wildlife intrusion or security concerns. The fence was constructed of steel mesh panels, standing 8 feet high, designed more to keep curious animals away from dangerous equipment than to provide serious security. Bill carried a flashlight, radio, and flare gun, along with a detailed checklist of areas that required inspection during each patrol. The perimeter fence enclosed an area of approximately 5 acres, including all the major buildings, equipment installations, and work areas. The fence was interrupted by 2 gates, the main entrance that provided access to the ice road, and a secondary gate on the opposite side that led to the helicopter landing pad and emergency supply cache. Both gates were secured with heavy chains and locks, though the locks were more symbolic than practical, given the remote location and harsh environment. As Bill walked the eastern section of fence line, his flashlight beam illuminated a series of tracks in the snow that immediately caught his attention. The tracks were much larger than anything he had seen before, roughly circular impressions measuring nearly 12 inches in diameter, with clearly visible claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe prints. The tracks formed a path that paralleled the fence for approximately 50 yards before disappearing into the darkness beyond the range of his flashlight. Bill knelt down to examine the tracks more closely, his breath forming clouds of ice crystals in the beam of his flashlight. Each track showed the distinctive pattern of a polar bear's paw, 5 toes with prominent claws, a large heel pad, and fur marks around the edges where the bear's foot had pressed into the snow. The depth of the impressions suggested an animal weighing at least 800 pounds, possibly more. Most disturbing was the fact that the tracks were fresh, so fresh that the edges had not yet been softened by wind or additional snowfall. The discovery filled Bill with a mixture of excitement and dread. Polar bears were magnificent creatures, perfectly adapted to survive in the Arctic environment, but they were also incredibly dangerous predators with the strength to kill a human being with a single swipe of their massive paws. Company protocol required immediate notification of management and implementation of enhanced security measures whenever polar bears were detected in the area. Bill activated his radio and called Frank in the control shed. "Control, this is Perimeter Patrol. I've got fresh polar bear tracks along the eastern fence line. Large adult, probably male, tracks are very recent." Frank's voice crackled back through the radio static. "Copy that, Bill." "How recent?" "Within the last hour, maybe less. The tracks are clean and sharp, no wind damage. This bear was here very recently." Frank consulted the emergency procedures manual that was mounted on the wall next to his radio equipment. Polar bear sightings required immediate implementation of Protocol 7, which included notification of all personnel, suspension of outdoor activities, securing of all food and garbage, and establishment of enhanced watch procedures until the animal moved away from the area. All crew, this is Control," Frank announced over the facility-wide intercom system. "We have confirmed polar bear activity in the immediate area." Protocol 7 is now in effect. All outdoor activities are suspended until further notice. Report your current location and status immediately. The responses came back quickly as crew members acknowledged the alert and reported their positions. Carlos and Tommy were still in the maintenance shed working on the generator. Marcus and Steve were in the pipe storage yard, organizing equipment for the next day's work. David was in the drill control room, monitoring the automated systems. Elena was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Patty was in the medical bay, updating inventory records. Miguel was in the sleeping quarters, reading. Bobby Henderson's voice came over the radio from his private quarters. "Control, this is Henderson. What's the assessment of immediate threat level?" Frank consulted the manual again before responding. Based on fresh tracks and proximity to the facility, threat level is elevated. Recommend maintaining Protocol 7 until we can confirm the animal has moved away from the area. Understood. Bill, continue your patrol, but maintain radio contact every 10 minutes. Everyone else, stay inside until further notice. The implementation of Protocol 7 transformed the atmosphere on the platform from routine work activity to heightened alertness. Crew members who had been moving freely between buildings were now confined to their current locations. All exterior doors were checked to ensure they were properly secured. Food waste was transferred to sealed containers that would be stored in a locked shed until it could be properly disposed of. Bill continued his patrol with increased caution, following the bear tracks as they led away from the fence line toward the northwest. The tracks maintained a steady direction for approximately 200 yards, before disappearing onto a patch of wind-scoured ice where no footprints could be preserved. Bill spent several minutes searching the area with his flashlight, but found no indication of where the bear had gone after leaving the trackable snow. At 11:45 p.m., Bill completed his patrol and returned to the security office, a small heated building near the main gate that served as his base of operations. The office contained monitoring equipment for the facility's security cameras, communication gear, and a small collection of reference materials about Arctic wildlife. Bill immediately began reviewing the camera footage from the evening, looking for any sign of the polar bear's approach or departure. The security camera system consisted of 6 cameras positioned around the perimeter of the facility, each equipped with infrared capability for night vision. The cameras were mounted on poles and constantly swept back and forth, providing overlapping coverage of the fence line and immediate surrounding area. However, the extreme weather conditions frequently caused camera malfunctions, and several units had been offline for the past week due to ice buildup on the lenses. Bill's review of the camera footage revealed nothing useful. The combination of blowing snow, ice-covered lenses, and limited infrared range made it impossible to detect anything beyond the immediate vicinity of each camera mount. If the polar bear had approached the facility, it had done so in a blind spot or during a period when the cameras were malfunctioning. Meanwhile, Frank continued monitoring the drilling operation while maintaining radio contact with the dispersed crew members. The confined environment created by Protocol 7 meant that any equipment problems would be much more difficult to address, since crew members could not safely move between buildings to provide assistance. Frank made several adjustments to the drilling parameters to compensate for the reduced availability of personnel. At midnight, Frank conducted the scheduled check-in with the day shift supervisor in Prudhoe Bay, reporting the polar bear activity and the implementation of Protocol 7. The supervisor, Janet Morrison, was a veteran of Arctic operations who had dealt with similar situations many times over her 15-year career. She confirmed that Frank was following the correct procedures and advised him to maintain heightened security until the bear's departure could be confirmed. "How long do you typically maintain Protocol 7?" Frank asked. "Depends on the bear," Janet replied. "Sometimes they pass through in a few hours. Sometimes they hang around for days if they find something interesting. You'll need to make that judgment based on what you observe. Just remember that polar bears are incredibly intelligent and persistent. If one has found your facility, it's probably for a reason. The comment about intelligence and persistence was unsettling. Frank had heard stories about polar bears that learned to associate human activity with potential food sources, becoming increasingly bold in their attempts to access facilities and equipment. A bear that had identified the platform as a place of interest might not be easily discouraged from returning. At 12:30 a.m., Bill conducted another perimeter patrol, this time accompanied by Carlos, who had volunteered to serve as backup security. The two men walked the fence line together, their flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the snow-covered ground. They found no new tracks or signs of the polar bear's return, but the presence of the earlier tracks continued to create an atmosphere of tension and alertness. "I've never seen bear tracks that big," Carlos commented as they examined the impressions near the eastern fence. "That's got to be a huge animal." "Adult male polar bears can weigh over 1,500 pounds, Bill replied. "This one looks like it's in that category. They're incredibly powerful and surprisingly fast. A bear that size could probably tear through this fence without much effort if it really wanted to get inside." The thought of the fence being inadequate protection had occurred to several crew members since the discovery of the tracks. The 8-foot steel mesh barrier was designed to deter casual wildlife intrusion, not to stop a determined polar bear. If the animal decided to investigate the facility more closely, the fence would provide little more than a psychological barrier. At 1 a.m., Frank made the decision to increase the frequency of security patrols and establish additional watch posts to provide better coverage of the facility perimeter. Tommy volunteered to monitor the facility from the second-floor window of the main equipment building, which provided an elevated view of most of the work area. David agreed to maintain watch from the drill control room, which had large windows facing north and west. The enhanced security measures required careful coordination to ensure that radio communications remained clear and that each watch post understood its responsibilities and coverage area. Frank found himself serving as the central coordinator, receiving reports from the various observation points and maintaining communication with the Prudhoe Bay Operations Center. At 1:30 a.m., Tommy reported movement in the area beyond the northeastern corner of the facility. "Control, I've got something moving out there, maybe 300 yards northeast of the perimeter. It's too dark to make positive identification, but it's bigger than a fox." Frank immediately alerted all watch posts and requested additional observations. David reported that he could see something in the same general area, but could not determine what type of animal it might be. Bill and Carlos prepared to conduct another patrol, this time focusing on the northeastern section of fence line. "All stations maintain visual contact but do not approach the perimeter fence," Frank instructed. "We need to determine what we're dealing with before taking any action." The minutes that followed were filled with tension as the various watchposts attempted to track the movement in the darkness. The limited visibility and blowing snow made accurate observation nearly impossible, but the consensus was that something large was moving in the area beyond the facility. Whether it was the same polar bear that had left the tracks or a different animal was impossible to determine. At 1:45 a.m., the movement disappeared entirely, leaving the watchposts with nothing to observe except empty darkness. Frank maintained the heightened alert status, but allowed normal monitoring activities to resume. The crew members who had been confined to buildings were permitted to move between structures if absolutely necessary, but all outdoor activities remained suspended. By 2 a.m., the initial excitement and tension had begun to give way to fatigue and the routine of maintaining security watches. Frank found himself struggling to maintain alertness as the combination of physical exhaustion and mental stress took its toll. He increased his coffee consumption and made frequent position changes to avoid becoming too comfortable in any one location. The drilling operation continued to function normally despite the security concerns, with the automated systems maintaining steady progress under Frank's supervision. The hydraulic leak that had been repaired during the day shift showed no signs of recurring, and the new pipe sections were performing within acceptable parameters. Under normal circumstances, Frank would have been pleased with the smooth operation, but the persistent concern about the polar bear made it difficult to feel satisfied with routine success. At 2:30 a.m., Elena announced over the intercom that she had prepared hot coffee and sandwiches for anyone who wanted them. The offer was welcomed by the tired crew members, but Protocol 7 meant that the food had to be delivered to each building rather than having everyone gather in the mess hall. Elena and Miguel worked together to distribute the food, moving quickly between buildings while maintaining radio contact with Frank. The food delivery provided a brief respite from the tension, giving crew members an opportunity to interact with each other and share their observations and concerns about the polar bear situation. Most of the crew had experience with various types of wildlife encounters, but polar bears represented a level of danger that was qualitatively different from anything they had previously faced. "My brother-in-law works on a platform near Barrow," Marcus mentioned during the food delivery. "He told me about a polar bear that stalked their facility for 3 days, waiting for someone to come outside. They finally had to call in wildlife management to relocate the animal." "How do they relocate a polar bear?" David asked. "Tranquilizer dart and helicopter," Marcus replied, "but it's expensive and dangerous. The bear has to be transported hundreds of miles to make sure it doesn't come back." The conversation highlighted the potential for a prolonged standoff if the polar bear decided to remain in the area. The facility was not equipped for an extended siege, and the crew was not trained for dealing with persistent wildlife threats. If the situation continued beyond the current shift rotation, it would require intervention from outside authorities. At 3 a.m., Frank received a radio call from Janet Morrison in Prudhoe Bay. "How's your bear situation developing?" she asked. "We had possible movement about an hour and a half ago, but nothing since then," Frank reported. "No new tracks, no visual confirmation. The crew is maintaining security watches, but we haven't seen anything definitive." "That's typical polar bear behavior," Janet explained. "They'll often scout an area for several hours before deciding whether to approach more closely. The bear is probably still in the vicinity, assessing whether your facility represents a threat, a food source, or just an obstacle to avoid." "What's your recommendation for continuing operations?" "Maintain Protocol 7 until dawn, then reassess based on daylight observations. Polar bears are most active during the night and early morning hours. If you don't see signs of the bear during daylight, you can probably resume normal operations with enhanced security measures." The plan to reassess at dawn provided a specific timeline for the current security measures, which helped reduce the uncertainty that had been affecting crew morale. Frank announced the plan over the facility intercom, advising everyone that they would maintain the current alert status for approximately 4 more hours before conducting a comprehensive evaluation of the situation. At 3:30 a.m., Bill conducted another perimeter patrol, this time alone, since Carlos had returned to his generator repair work in the maintenance shed. The patrol revealed no new tracks or signs of wildlife activity, but Bill noticed that the wind had decreased significantly and the blowing snow had almost stopped entirely. The improved conditions would make wildlife observation much easier, but would also make human activity more visible to any animals in the area. The change in weather conditions prompted Frank to reconsider the security arrangements. With better visibility, the watch posts would be more effective at detecting approaching wildlife, but crew members moving between buildings would also be more exposed to potential threats. Frank decided to maintain the current restrictions on outdoor movement until the dawn reassessment could be completed. At 4 a.m., Tommy reported that he could see stars beginning to appear through breaks in the cloud cover. The clearing sky would provide natural light within a few hours, dramatically improving the crew's ability to monitor the surrounding area. However, it would also make the facility more visible to any wildlife in the vicinity, potentially attracting unwanted attention. Frank used the improving conditions to conduct a comprehensive review of the facility's security measures and emergency procedures. He verified that all crew members knew the locations of emergency exits, communication equipment, and first aid supplies. He also reviewed the procedures for requesting emergency assistance from outside agencies, including wildlife management authorities and medical evacuation services. The Emergency Procedures Manual contained detailed information about polar bear encounters, including warning signs of aggressive behavior, recommended responses to various types of encounters, and protocols for treating injuries caused by wildlife attacks. The information was sobering, particularly the sections dealing with the speed and power of polar bear attacks and the limited effectiveness of most defensive measures. According to the manual, an adult polar bear could run at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour for short distances, could swim for hours in near-freezing water, and possessed the strength to break through most barriers that were not specifically designed to exclude them. The animals were also intelligent enough to learn from experience, meaning that a bear that had successfully accessed human facilities in the past would be more likely to attempt similar intrusions in the future. At 4:30 a.m., the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, providing just enough light to make objects visible at greater distances than had been possible during the night. Frank immediately noticed that the improved visibility revealed several areas around the facility that had been completely hidden during the hours of darkness. The revelation was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it meant better security observation, concerning because it highlighted how limited their awareness had been during the night. David reported from the drill control room that he could now see clearly for several hundred yards in all directions, and that there was no sign of wildlife in the visible area. Tommy confirmed similar observations from his elevated position in the equipment building. Bill conducted a walking patrol of the entire perimeter fence and found no new tracks or signs of recent animal activity. At 5 a.m., Frank made the decision to begin a gradual relaxation of Protocol 7 restrictions while maintaining enhanced security measures. Crew members were permitted to move between buildings if absolutely necessary, but outdoor work activities remained suspended until the full dawn assessment could be completed. The compromise allowed essential operations to continue while preserving most of the security benefits of the full protocol. Elena took advantage of the relaxed restrictions to begin preparing breakfast for the crew, though she remained in radio contact with Frank and was prepared to immediately return to secure areas if wildlife was detected. The prospect of a hot breakfast after the long, tense night was welcomed by everyone, even though the continued security concerns prevented a full return to normal routine. At 5:30 a.m., with full daylight providing excellent visibility across the entire area around the facility, Frank conducted a comprehensive assessment of the situation. All watch posts reported no signs of wildlife activity. Bill's patrol of the perimeter had found no new tracks or other evidence of animal presence. The weather conditions were calm and clear, providing ideal observation conditions. Based on the assessment, Frank made the decision to officially terminate Protocol 7 while implementing enhanced security measures that would remain in effect until the end of the current shift rotation. The enhanced measures included increased frequency of perimeter patrols, continuous manning of at least one observation post, and immediate implementation of full Protocol 7 if any wildlife activity was detected. The decision to resume normal operations was met with relief by the crew, who had been confined and restricted for more than 6 hours. However, the experience had created a heightened awareness of their vulnerability and isolation that would persist throughout the remainder of their time on the platform. Bobby Henderson emerged from his quarters as the crew gathered for breakfast, having monitored the entire situation through radio communications, but remaining in his command position to coordinate any necessary emergency response. He commended Frank for his handling of the security situation and praised the crew for their cooperation and professionalism during the extended alert. "That was exactly how these situations should be handled," Bobby announced to the assembled crew. "Professional, calm, and by the book. The bear is gone, but we'll maintain enhanced security for the rest of our rotation." Everyone did exactly what they were supposed to do. Breakfast was consumed with more conversation and interaction than was typical for the usually tired and quiet crew. The shared experience of the polar bear alert had created a sense of camaraderie and mutual dependence that enhanced the social dynamics of the isolated group. Several crew members shared stories of previous wildlife encounters, creating an informal education session about Arctic survival. Frank returned to the control shed after breakfast, resuming his normal monitoring responsibilities while maintaining radio contact with Bill, who continued enhanced security patrols. The drilling operation had functioned flawlessly throughout the night despite the security concerns, and Frank was able to focus on optimizing the equipment performance and planning for the day shift transition. At 7 a.m., the day shift crew began arriving via helicopter from Prudhoe Bay, bringing fresh personnel and supplies for the continuing operation. Frank briefed the incoming supervisor about the polar bear activity and the security measures that had been implemented. The day shift would maintain enhanced security protocols while resuming full operational activities. The night shift crew gathered their personal equipment and prepared for the helicopter flight back to Prudhoe Bay, looking forward to hot showers, comfortable beds, and the psychological relief of being in a larger, more secure facility. Frank was particularly eager to call Margaret and hear about routine family activities that would help him forget the tension and isolation of the past night. As the helicopter lifted off from the platform, carrying the night shift crew back to civilization, Frank looked down at the facility where they had spent the past 8 hours in heightened alert. From the air, the platform looked small and vulnerable, a tiny outpost of human activity surrounded by vast expanses of ice and snow. The sight reinforced his appreciation for the dangers they faced and the importance of the security procedures that had protected them through the night. The flight to Prudhoe Bay took 45 minutes, providing Frank with time to reflect on the experience and consider what he had learned about wildlife safety and emergency management. The polar bear encounter had been his first serious wildlife threat during his 18 years in the oil industry, and it had highlighted gaps in his knowledge and preparedness that he was determined to address. Upon arriving in Prudhoe Bay, Frank immediately called Margaret to let her know that he was safe and that the shift had been completed without incident. He did not mention the polar bear encounter, knowing that such information would only increase her anxiety about his work and her pressure for him to find employment closer to home. "How was your night?" Margaret asked. "Routine," Frank replied. "Cold, but everything went smoothly." "How are the kids?" Margaret provided updates on Sarah's basketball games and Michael's progress in his algebra class, routine family information that helped Frank transition from the isolation and danger of the platform to the normalcy of home life. The conversation was brief, but served its purpose of maintaining the emotional connection that sustained Frank through his extended rotations in the field. After completing his phone call, Frank joined several crew members for a meal in the Prudhoe Bay cafeteria, a facility that seemed luxurious compared to the cramped conditions on the platform. The conversation inevitably turned to the polar bear encounter, with each crew member sharing their perspective on the experience and their concerns about future wildlife threats. "I've been thinking about what would have happened if that bear had decided to test the fence," Carlos mentioned. "We really don't have any way to stop a determined polar bear if it wants to get inside the facility." "The company needs to invest in better security measures," Tommy added. "Motion sensors, better lighting, maybe even some kind of deterrent system. We can't rely on luck to keep us safe out there." Frank agreed with the concerns, but knew that convincing management to invest in enhanced security measures would require documentation of specific threats and cost-benefit analysis of various protection options. The polar bear encounter would definitely be included in his shift report, but one incident was unlikely to trigger major changes in security protocols. After lunch, Frank checked into his assigned room in the company dormitory, a small but comfortable space with a private bathroom, internet access, and cable television. The luxury of a hot shower and clean clothes helped him begin the psychological transition from work mode to rest mode, though the memory of the polar bear tracks in the snow continued to occupy his thoughts. Frank spent the afternoon catching up on personal email, video chatting with his family, and reading news from outside Alaska. The routine activities helped restore his sense of connection to the world beyond the oil fields, though the contrast between his dangerous work environment and the comfortable lives of his friends and relatives was sometimes difficult to process. That evening, Frank joined several crew members at a local bar in Prudhoe Bay, a modest establishment that catered to oil field workers and provided a social environment for men who spent most of their time in isolation. The conversation continued to focus on the polar bear encounter, with various theories about the animal's behavior and speculation about the likelihood of future encounters. "Bears are creatures of habit," Bill explained over beer and hamburgers. "If that one found something interesting about our facility, it might come back. We need to be prepared for that possibility." "What kind of preparation?" David asked. "Better perimeter security, improved communication procedures, maybe some kind of early warning system. And we all need better training on wildlife behavior and survival techniques." The discussion continued late into the evening, with crew members sharing research they had conducted on polar bear behavior and security measures used by other Arctic facilities. The conversation was educational and helped the men process their shared experience while developing ideas for improving their safety and security. Frank returned to his dormitory room at nearly midnight, exhausted from the combination of work stress and social interaction. He set his alarm for 8 a.m., planning to spend the following day resting and preparing for the next rotation, which would begin in 3 days. As he settled into bed, Frank's last thought was about the polar bear tracks in the snow and the realization that his work environment contained dangers that he had never fully appreciated. The following morning, Frank woke refreshed and eager to continue processing the previous night's experience. He spent time researching polar bear behavior and Arctic safety measures, using the internet resources available in the dormitory. The research confirmed many of the concerns that had been discussed by his crew and highlighted additional security considerations that had not been addressed in their facility's emergency procedures. Frank learned that polar bears were remarkably intelligent and adaptable predators that could learn to associate human activity with food sources. Bears that had previously encountered humans were more likely to approach facilities and less likely to be deterred by standard security measures. The animals were also capable of remarkable patience, sometimes waiting for hours or days for opportunities to access potential food sources. Most concerning was the information about polar bear attacks on humans. While such attacks were relatively rare, they were almost always fatal due to the size and power of the animals. Standard defensive measures such as noisemakers and flares were often ineffective against determined bears, and firearms were the only reliable means of stopping an attacking animal. The research reinforced Frank's conviction that the facility's security measures were inadequate for dealing with serious wildlife threats. The 8-foot fence and basic lighting system provided minimal protection against a determined polar bear, and the crew lacked the training and equipment necessary to defend themselves effectively. Frank spent the second day of his break visiting with Margaret and the children in Fairbanks, enjoying the normalcy of family life and temporarily forgetting the dangers and isolation of his work environment. However, the polar bear encounter had created a new awareness of mortality and vulnerability that influenced his interactions with his family and his consideration of career alternatives. "You seem different," Margaret observed during a quiet moment while the children were watching television. "More serious than usual." "Just thinking about things," Frank replied. "About the work, about priorities, about what's really important." Margaret did not press for details, understanding that Frank often needed time to process his work experiences before he was ready to discuss them. However, she was encouraged by any indication that Frank might be reconsidering his commitment to the dangerous and isolating work of the oil fields. On the third day of his break, Frank reported to the Prudhoe Bay Operations Center for the pre-rotation briefing and equipment assignment. The briefing included updates on weather conditions, equipment status, and safety considerations for the upcoming shift. Frank was pleased to learn that enhanced wildlife security measures had been implemented at Platform 7 based on his report of the polar bear encounter. The enhanced measures included motion-activated cameras positioned around the perimeter fence, improved lighting for the work areas, and additional wildlife deterrent devices such as air horns and flare guns. The crew would also receive additional training on polar bear safety and emergency response procedures. Janet Morrison conducted the security briefing, providing detailed information about polar bear behavior and the proper response to various types of encounters. The training included practical demonstrations of deterrent devices and emergency communication procedures, as well as discussion of the facility's evacuation plan in case of serious wildlife threats. The most important thing to remember about polar bears is that they are unpredictable, Janet explained. They might ignore you completely, or they might become fixated on your facility for reasons we don't understand. The key is to maintain constant awareness and never become complacent about security procedures. Frank and his crew members paid close attention to the training, recognizing that their previous encounter had been a learning experience that might help them handle future wildlife threats more effectively. The enhanced security measures and improved training created a sense of confidence that had been lacking during their previous rotation. The helicopter flight back to Platform 7 was conducted under clear weather conditions that provided excellent visibility of the surrounding terrain. Frank looked carefully for any signs of wildlife activity, but saw nothing unusual in the vast expanse of ice and snow. The facility appeared normal and secure from the air, though Frank now understood how little protection the perimeter fence would provide against a determined polar bear. The day shift crew reported that there had been no wildlife activity during the 3 days since Frank's crew had departed. The enhanced security measures had been installed and tested, and the facility was operating normally under the improved safety protocols. Frank was pleased to see the upgrades, but remained aware that they represented only incremental improvements in security rather than fundamental solutions to the wildlife threat. The December 12th rotation began with the same routine safety briefing and work assignments, but with the addition of enhanced wildlife awareness procedures. Frank returned to his familiar position in the control shed, monitoring the drilling operation while maintaining communication with security patrols and watch posts. The new motion-activated cameras provided much better coverage of the perimeter area, and the improved lighting made visual observation more effective during the dark Arctic winter. For the first 3 days of the rotation, operations proceeded normally with no signs of wildlife activity. The crew gradually relaxed into their familiar routines, while maintaining the enhanced security procedures that had become part of their standard operating practice. Frank began to hope that the polar bear had moved permanently away from the area and that the December 6th encounter had been an isolated incident. On December 15th, the motion-activated cameras detected movement in the area beyond the northeastern corner of the facility. Bill's investigation revealed fresh polar bear tracks, but the animal had not approached the perimeter fence and had apparently moved through the area without showing particular interest in the facility. The incident was logged and reported to Prudhoe Bay, but did not require implementation of full Protocol 7. The December 15th sighting confirmed that polar bears were active in the area and that future encounters were possible. However, the bear's behavior suggested that it was simply passing through rather than investigating the facility as a potential food source. Frank maintained heightened awareness but did not change the normal work routine. December 18th brought the worst weather of the rotation, with wind speeds reaching 70 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to -51 degrees Fahrenheit. The extreme conditions forced suspension of all outdoor activities and created equipment problems that required constant attention from the crew. Frank spent most of the day dealing with frozen pipes and malfunctioning sensors while maintaining communication with crew members who were scattered throughout the facility. The severe weather continued through December 19th, making it impossible to conduct meaningful security patrols or wildlife observation. The motion-activated cameras frequently malfunctioned due to ice buildup, and the facility's lighting systems struggled to maintain illumination in the face of constant snow and wind. Frank found himself essentially operating blind, unable to monitor the surrounding area for wildlife activity. On December 20th, the weather began to improve, with wind speeds decreasing and snow changing from a blinding blizzard to occasional light flurries. Frank was eager to resume normal security procedures and assess whether the severe weather had brought any wildlife activity to the area. Bill conducted a comprehensive perimeter patrol as soon as conditions permitted, looking for tracks or other signs of animal presence. The patrol revealed extensive evidence of wildlife activity during the storm. Multiple sets of tracks indicated that various animals had taken shelter near the facility during the worst of the weather. Most of the tracks appeared to be from Arctic foxes and caribou, but Bill also found several sets of polar bear tracks that were much fresher than those discovered on December 15th. The fresh polar bear tracks were concentrated around the southeastern section of the facility, near the generator building and fuel storage area. The tracks indicated that at least one bear had spent considerable time investigating the area, walking back and forth along the fence line and apparently testing the barrier at several points. Most concerning was evidence that the bear had attempted to dig under the fence at the corner of the fuel storage compound. Frank immediately implemented Protocol 7 and notified all crew members of the wildlife threat. The evidence of persistent investigation and barrier testing suggested a level of interest and determination that had not been present during the previous encounters. The bear was clearly attracted to something specific about the facility and was actively seeking access rather than simply passing through the area. "This is different from before," Bill reported during his briefing to the assembled crew. "The previous bears seemed to be just checking us out. This one is showing problem-solving behavior, looking for ways to get inside. That's much more dangerous." Bobby Henderson agreed with Bill's assessment and ordered immediate implementation of enhanced security measures beyond the standard Protocol 7 procedures. All crew members would remain inside buildings, except for absolutely essential activities, and those activities would be conducted with armed escort. The facility's emergency supplies would be checked and prepared for possible evacuation. Frank found himself in the position of coordinating a much more serious emergency response than anything he had previously experienced. The combination of the bear's persistent behavior and the crew's isolation created a situation that was genuinely threatening rather than simply inconvenient. For the first time since beginning his oilfield career, Frank began to seriously consider the possibility that he might not survive his shift rotation. The enhanced security measures created significant operational challenges, as many routine maintenance activities could not be performed safely under the current restrictions. Frank was forced to make difficult decisions about which equipment problems could be ignored and which required immediate attention despite the security risks. The drilling operation continued to function, but several secondary systems began showing signs of stress due to deferred maintenance. At 2 a.m. on December 21st, the motion-activated cameras detected movement directly at the perimeter fence near the fuel storage area. Bill's immediate investigation revealed that a large polar bear was actively working to create an opening in the fence, using its claws and body weight to bend and tear the steel mesh. The bear was clearly visible in the facility's lighting and appeared completely unafraid of human presence. Frank immediately activated the facility's emergency alarm system and began implementing evacuation procedures, while Bill attempted to deter the bear using air horns and flare guns. The bear reacted to the noise and lights by temporarily moving away from the fence, but it did not leave the immediate area and continued to observe the facility from a distance of approximately 50 yards. All crew, prepare for immediate evacuation," Frank announced over the intercom system. "We have an aggressive polar bear attempting to breach the perimeter. Move to your assigned evacuation positions and await further instructions." The crew responded quickly and professionally, gathering their emergency gear and moving to the designated assembly areas inside the most secure buildings. Elena and Miguel were assigned to the communications building, where they would maintain radio contact with Prudhoe Bay and coordinate emergency response. Carlos and Tommy moved to the equipment shed, where they would monitor critical systems and prepare for shutdown if necessary. David and Marcus joined Frank in the control shed, which served as the primary command post for emergency operations. Patty established a medical station in the mess hall, preparing supplies and equipment for treating potential injuries. Steve and Jimmy were assigned to the generator building, where they would maintain power systems and monitor the bear's activity from a secure observation position. Bobby maintained overall command from his quarters, coordinating with Frank and monitoring communications with outside authorities. The evacuation preparations were completed within 15 minutes, leaving the crew ready for helicopter extraction if the bear successfully breached the perimeter or if its behavior became more aggressive. However, helicopter operations in the extreme cold and darkness would be extremely dangerous, and evacuation would only be attempted as a last resort. Bill continued monitoring the bear from the security office, using the facility's camera system and direct observation through reinforced windows. The bear had returned to the fence and was systematically testing different sections, apparently looking for weak points or existing damage that could be exploited. The animal's behavior demonstrated remarkable intelligence and persistence that was deeply unsettling to observe. "It's not just looking for food," Bill reported to Frank. "This bear is problem-solving. It's testing the fence systematically, learning from each attempt. That level of cognitive behavior makes it much more dangerous than a typical opportunistic predator." Frank relayed Bill's observations to Prudhoe Bay, requesting immediate assistance from wildlife management authorities. However, the extreme weather conditions and darkness made immediate intervention impossible. The crew would have to deal with the bear threat using only the resources available at the facility. At 2:30 a.m., the bear succeeded in creating a small opening in the fence by pulling apart two sections of mesh near a support post. The opening was not large enough for the bear to pass through, but it demonstrated that the fence was not an insurmountable barrier. The bear continued working to enlarge the opening, using its claws and teeth to tear at the damaged mesh. Frank made the decision to use the facility's emergency flare launcher to attempt to drive the bear away from the fence. The device was designed to signal rescue aircraft, but could also be used to create loud noises and bright lights that might deter wildlife. Frank aimed the launcher toward the area near the bear and fired a series of 3 flares in rapid succession. The flares created brilliant illumination and sharp explosive sounds that caused the bear to immediately move away from the fence and retreat approximately 100 yards into the darkness. However, the animal did not leave the area entirely and could be seen moving back and forth beyond the range of the facility's lighting. Frank hoped that the demonstration of defensive capability might convince the bear to seek easier prey elsewhere. For the next hour, the bear remained in the vicinity but did not approach the fence. Frank maintained the evacuation readiness while monitoring the animal's behavior and coordinating with Prudhoe Bay on possible response options. The Wildlife Management authorities were preparing to dispatch a helicopter as soon as weather conditions permitted, but that would not be possible until full daylight provided safe flying conditions. At 3:45 a.m., the bear disappeared entirely from the observable area, leaving the crew uncertain whether it had departed permanently or was simply moving beyond the range of their detection capabilities. Frank maintained the emergency status while conducting systematic searches of the perimeter using cameras and direct observation from secure positions. Bill's patrol of the interior perimeter revealed that the bear had indeed left the immediate area, but the damaged fence section and the animal's demonstrated persistence suggested that it would likely return. Frank made the decision to maintain emergency readiness while beginning preparations for permanent departure from the facility. "This bear is not going to give up," Frank explained to the crew during a 4 a.m. briefing. "It's shown that it can breach our security and that it's not deterred by our defensive measures. We need to prepare for evacuation as soon as helicopter operations are possible." The crew agreed with Frank's assessment and began preparing for emergency departure. Non-essential equipment was shut down and secured, critical data was backed up and prepared for transmission to Prudhoe Bay, and personal gear was packed for rapid departure. The facility would be abandoned temporarily until wildlife management authorities could address the bear threat. At 5:30 a.m., as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Frank received confirmation that emergency helicopter evacuation would be possible within 2 hours. The crew continued their departure preparations while maintaining security watches for any sign of the bear's return. The damaged fence section was monitored continuously, as it represented the most likely point for any future breach attempt. At 6:15 a.m., Tommy reported movement in the area beyond the northeastern corner of the facility. "I've got something moving out there. Looks like our friend is back." Frank immediately alerted all positions and requested detailed observations. David confirmed the sighting from the drill control room, reporting that a large polar bear was approaching the facility from the direction of the previous night's retreat. The bear appeared to be the same animal based on its size and distinctive gait pattern. "All positions, the bear is returning," Frank announced over the intercom. "Maintain security positions and prepare for immediate evacuation if necessary. Helicopter ETA is approximately 90 minutes. The bear's return during daylight provided much better observation opportunities, allowing the crew to study its behavior and appearance in detail. The animal was indeed massive, easily weighing over 1,200 pounds, with distinctive scars on its face and front paws that suggested extensive experience in aggressive encounters. Most disturbing was the bear's obvious familiarity with human facilities and lack of fear regarding human presence. The bear proceeded directly to the damaged fence section and resumed its efforts to enlarge the opening. Working with remarkable efficiency and intelligence, the animal used its claws to grip and tear the mesh while using its body weight to bend the support posts. Within 15 minutes, the bear had created an opening large enough to pass through. "Fence breach in progress," Bill reported with obvious tension in his voice. "The bear will be inside the perimeter within minutes." Frank immediately ordered all personnel to secure positions and activated the facility's emergency beacon to alert the incoming helicopter crew to the urgent situation. The bear's entry into the facility compound would transform the threat from a potential danger to an immediate emergency requiring immediate evacuation or armed intervention. The bear paused at the enlarged opening, surveying the facility interior before committing to entry. The animal's cautious behavior suggested awareness that it was entering a potentially dangerous environment, but its persistence indicated that whatever had attracted its attention was worth the risk. After several minutes of observation, the bear squeezed through the opening and entered the facility compound. Once inside the perimeter, the bear began a systematic investigation of the various buildings and equipment installations. It moved with obvious intelligence and purpose, testing doors and windows while investigating areas that might contain food or other items of interest. The bear's behavior was methodical rather than frantic, suggesting confidence in its ability to handle any threats that might emerge. Frank found himself in the unprecedented position of having a massive predator roaming freely inside his facility, while his crew remained trapped in various buildings. The situation was beyond anything covered in the Emergency Procedures Manual, requiring real-time decision-making based on incomplete information and limited options. "Helicopter inbound, ETA 45 minutes. Came the radio call from Prudhoe Bay. "Be prepared for immediate extraction from the designated landing zone." The helicopter landing zone was located approximately 50 yards from the main complex, requiring the crew to move across open ground that would be dominated by the polar bear. Frank realized that evacuation might not be possible if the bear remained active in the compound area. Alternative extraction methods would have to be considered, including the possibility of landing the helicopter directly on the roof of one of the larger buildings. At 6:45 a.m., the bear approached the control shed, where Frank, David, and Marcus were monitoring the situation. The building's reinforced construction and secure doors provided protection, but the bear's investigation was extremely unsettling for the men inside. They could hear the animal moving around the building, testing the door and windows, while apparently trying to understand what was inside. "It knows we're in here," David whispered, though there was no rational reason to believe that speaking quietly would make any difference. Frank nodded, watching through the reinforced window as the massive predator moved around the building with obvious intelligence and purpose. The bear's behavior was not random or opportunistic. It was conducting a systematic investigation based on some specific attraction or motivation that Frank could not understand. The bear spent nearly 10 minutes investigating the control shed before moving on to examine other buildings in the compound. Frank used the opportunity to radio the other crew positions and verify that everyone remained secure. All positions reported that their buildings were holding and that the bear had not attempted to force entry into any structures. At 7 a.m., the bear approached the mess hall where Patty had established her medical station. The building's large windows and multiple doors made it potentially more vulnerable than some of the other structures, and Frank was concerned about Patty's safety if the bear decided to attempt forced entry. "Patty, how's your situation?" Frank called over the radio. "The bear is outside investigating the windows," Patty replied calmly. "The building seems secure, but I can see this animal is much larger than I expected. It's absolutely massive." The bear spent several minutes examining the mess hall before moving on to the generator building, where Steve and Jimmy were maintaining their observation post. Frank was relieved that the animal had not attempted to break into any buildings, but he remained concerned about what would happen when the evacuation helicopter arrived and created additional noise and activity. At 7:15 a.m., Frank received an update from the helicopter crew. "Evacuation flight inbound, ETA 20 minutes. What's the current status of wildlife activity?" "Large polar bear is active inside the facility compound," Frank reported. "All personnel are secure in buildings, but the bear is between our positions and the landing zone. We may need alternative extraction methods." "Understood. We're equipped with wildlife deterrent devices and will attempt to clear the landing zone. Be prepared for rapid evacuation once the area is secure." The prospect of the helicopter crew having to confront the polar bear to clear the landing zone was deeply concerning to Frank. Helicopter operations were inherently dangerous in Arctic conditions, and adding an aggressive wildlife encounter would dramatically increase the risks to everyone involved. At 7:25 a.m., the sound of approaching helicopter rotors became audible over the facility compound. The bear immediately reacted to the noise, moving toward the anticipated landing zone and positioning itself where it would directly confront the aircraft. Frank realized that the bear was not going to be easily intimidated by the helicopter and that the evacuation might require armed intervention. "Evacuation helicopter. Be advised that the polar bear is positioned directly in the landing zone and does not appear to be retreating from the aircraft noise," Frank radioed to the incoming crew. "Roger, we see the bear," came the reply. "We're going to attempt dispersal using noise and flare devices. All personnel prepare for immediate evacuation once the zone is clear." Frank watched through the control shed window as the helicopter approached the facility, flying low and creating maximum noise in an attempt to drive the bear away from the landing area. The bear reacted by standing on its hind legs to get a better view of the aircraft, but it did not retreat from the area. If anything, the bear seemed to be studying the helicopter with the same systematic intelligence it had applied to investigating the buildings. The helicopter crew fired several flares toward the bear while maintaining a safe distance from the ground. The flares created bright lights and explosive sounds, but the bear's reaction was limited to briefly moving a few yards before returning to its original position. The animal's persistence and lack of fear were deeply troubling indicators of its level of determination. "The bear is not responding to standard deterrent measures," the helicopter crew reported. "We're going to have to use more aggressive intervention methods." Frank knew that more aggressive intervention methods meant firearms, which represented a dangerous escalation of the situation. Shooting a polar bear from a helicopter in Arctic conditions was extremely risky for both the aircrew and the ground personnel, but it might be the only way to ensure safe evacuation of the facility. "All ground personnel, take cover and prepare for weapons fire," Frank announced over the facility intercom. "The helicopter crew is going to attempt to drive off the bear using lethal force if necessary." The crew members immediately moved to the most secure positions within their respective buildings, understanding that gunfire around a helicopter in extreme weather could create dangerous situations, including ricochets and aircraft damage. Frank positioned himself where he could observe the situation while remaining protected from potential weapons fire. The helicopter maneuvered to a position where the crew could engage the bear with minimum risk to the aircraft and ground personnel. Frank could see the door gunner preparing his weapon while the pilot maintained a stable, hovering position approximately 100 feet above the compound. The bear continued to observe the aircraft with apparent interest rather than fear. The first shot was fired as a warning, aimed into the snow near the bear rather than at the animal itself. The loud report of the rifle was clearly audible over the helicopter noise, and the impact of the bullet created a visible spray of snow and ice. The bear reacted by moving several yards away from the impact point, but did not leave the landing zone area. A second warning shot was fired with similar results. The bear moved slightly, but did not retreat beyond the immediate area. Frank began to realize that this particular animal was either unusually bold or had previous experience with firearms that had taught it to evaluate rather than flee from such threats. "The bear is not responding to warning shots," the helicopter crew reported. "We're going to have to use direct engagement to clear the landing zone." Frank understood the implications of that decision. Once the aircrew began shooting at the bear, the situation would escalate beyond wildlife management into a life-or-death confrontation. If the bear was wounded but not killed, it would become an extremely dangerous adversary that might attack the helicopter or the ground personnel. The third shot was aimed directly at the bear, striking the animal in the shoulder and causing it to roar with pain and anger. However, rather than fleeing, the bear charged toward the helicopter, which was forced to gain altitude rapidly to avoid the attacking animal. Frank watched in amazement as the wounded predator demonstrated both its resilience and its aggressive capabilities. "Bear is wounded and extremely aggressive," the helicopter crew reported. "We're going to need multiple shots to neutralize this threat." The aerial battle that followed was unlike anything Frank had ever witnessed. The helicopter crew fired repeatedly at the bear, while the aircraft maneuvered to avoid the animal's charges and attempts to reach the aircraft. The bear demonstrated remarkable persistence and intelligence, using buildings and equipment for cover, while continuing to challenge the helicopter's attempts to land. After nearly 10 minutes of combat, the helicopter crew finally succeeded in killing the bear with a shot to the head that dropped the animal immediately. Frank felt a mixture of relief and sorrow as he watched the massive predator collapse in the snow, its remarkable intelligence and persistence finally overcome by human technology and determination. "Landing zone is secure," the helicopter crew announced. "All personnel prepare for immediate evacuation." Frank quickly coordinated the evacuation procedures, ensuring that each crew member reached the landing zone safely and efficiently. The entire evacuation was completed within 15 minutes, with all personnel and essential equipment successfully extracted from the facility. As the helicopter lifted off from Platform 7, Frank looked down at the facility where he had spent so many rotations and at the body of the polar bear that had transformed a routine work assignment into a life-threatening emergency. The flight back to Prudhoe Bay was conducted in relative silence. As crew members processed the extraordinary experience they had shared, Frank found himself thinking about the bear's remarkable intelligence and persistence, wondering what had attracted the animal to their facility and whether other bears in the area might pose similar threats to future operations. Upon arrival in Prudhoe Bay, the crew was immediately debriefed by company officials and wildlife management authorities. Frank provided a detailed account of the bear's behavior and the crew's response to the threat, emphasizing the animal's systematic investigation and problem-solving capabilities that had made it particularly dangerous. The debriefing revealed that the bear was an adult male, weighing approximately 1,300 pounds, significantly larger than average for the species. The animal showed signs of previous interactions with human facilities, including scars that suggested encounters with vehicles or equipment. Wildlife officials speculated that the bear had learned to associate human activity with potential food sources, making it more dangerous than typical polar bears. Over the following days, Frank found himself the subject of media attention as news of the polar bear encounter spread throughout Alaska and the broader United States. He was interviewed by television reporters and newspaper journalists, providing detailed accounts of the crew's experience while emphasizing the professionalism and courage demonstrated by all personnel involved. The media coverage brought unwanted attention to Frank's family, with reporters attempting to interview Margaret and the children about their reactions to Frank's dangerous work. Margaret used the opportunity to renew her pressure for Frank to find employment closer to home, arguing that the polar bear encounter demonstrated the unacceptable risks associated with his current career. "You could have been killed," Margaret said during one of their conversations about the incident. "That bear was inside your facility, and there was nothing you could do to protect yourself. What would have happened to me and the kids if something had gone wrong with the evacuation?" Frank found himself unable to argue with Margaret's logic. The polar bear encounter had demonstrated his vulnerability and the limitations of the safety systems that were supposed to protect him. For the first time in his 18-year career, Frank began seriously considering alternative employment options that would allow him to remain close to his family while providing adequate income. The company conducted a comprehensive investigation of the incident, focusing on the adequacy of security measures and the effectiveness of emergency response procedures. Frank participated in multiple interviews and reviews, providing detailed information about the bear's behavior and the crew's response to the threat. The investigation concluded that the crew had performed professionally and effectively under extremely challenging circumstances. However, it also identified significant deficiencies in facility security and wildlife management protocols that needed to be addressed before resuming operations at Platform 7. The recommended security improvements included installation of electrified fencing, enhanced motion detection systems, improved lighting, and deployment of armed security personnel during periods of known wildlife activity. The estimated cost of these improvements exceeded $2 million, leading to intense discussions within the company about the cost-effectiveness of continued operations at the facility. Frank was offered a position at a facility closer to Fairbanks as recognition of his professional handling of the emergency situation. The position would involve a salary reduction of approximately $20,000 per year, but it would allow him to return home every night and eliminate the extended rotations that had created stress in his marriage and family relationships. After extensive discussion with Margaret and careful consideration of his priorities and goals, Frank accepted the position closer to home. The decision represented a significant change in lifestyle and financial circumstances, but it also provided the opportunity to rebuild his relationships with his family and reduce the physical and psychological stress associated with his work environment. The polar bear encounter had fundamentally changed Frank's perspective on risk, safety, and the balance between professional success and personal fulfillment. The experience had demonstrated that even the most experienced and prepared individuals could find themselves in situations beyond their control, where survival depended on teamwork, professional competence, and a considerable amount of luck. Frank's last rotation at Platform 7 was scheduled for January 2026. Providing an opportunity to return to the facility where he had faced his most significant professional challenge. The security improvements had been implemented, including the electrified fencing and enhanced detection systems that would have prevented the polar bear's entry into the compound. However, Frank found that returning to the facility created unexpected emotional responses, including anxiety and hypervigilance that interfered with his ability to perform his normal duties effectively. The sight of the repaired fence section and the knowledge of what had occurred there triggered memories and stress reactions that he had not anticipated. Frank completed his final rotation without incident, but he was relieved to leave Platform 7 permanently and begin his new position closer to home. The transition to a different work environment and schedule required significant adjustments, but the benefits to his family relationships and personal well-being quickly became apparent. Margaret noticed immediate improvements in Frank's mood and stress levels once he began working closer to home. The elimination of extended rotations allowed him to participate in family activities and maintain consistent involvement in his children's lives. Sarah and Michael expressed excitement about having their father available for school events and family dinners on a regular basis. Frank's new position involved overseeing maintenance operations at a facility that processed oil and gas from multiple North Slope operations, including Platform 7. The work was technically challenging and professionally satisfying, but it lacked the physical danger and isolation that had characterized his previous assignments. Over the months following his departure from Platform 7, Frank maintained contact with several crew members who had shared the polar bear experience. Carlos had also transferred to a position closer to his family, using the incident as motivation to prioritize personal relationships over maximum income. Tommy had remained in the field, but had requested assignment to facilities with enhanced security measures. Bill Tucker had retired from security work entirely, using his experience with the polar bear encounter to transition into a training role where he taught wildlife safety and emergency response procedures to other oilfield workers. His expertise was in high demand, as companies throughout the Arctic regions upgraded their security protocols and training programs. Bobby Henderson had been promoted to operations manager, overseeing safety and security improvements across multiple facilities. He frequently cited the Platform 7 polar bear encounter as an example of the importance of crew training, emergency preparedness, and effective leadership under extreme circumstances. The polar bear incident had become a case study used in training programs throughout the oil industry, highlighting both the effectiveness of proper emergency procedures and the importance of comprehensive security measures in wildlife habitat areas. Frank was occasionally invited to speak at training sessions, sharing his experience and emphasizing the lessons learned from the encounter. Frank's transition to his new work environment was not without challenges. The reduced income required adjustments to family spending patterns and long-term financial planning. However, Frank and Margaret found that the improved quality of life more than compensated for the financial sacrifices required by the career change. Sarah graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to attend the University of Alaska Anchorage, where she planned to study environmental science. Her choice of academic focus was influenced partly by her father's stories about the Arctic environment and wildlife, including the polar bear encounter that had changed the family's circumstances. Michael developed an interest in emergency management and public safety, inspired by his father's account of the crisis leadership and teamwork that had been required during the polar bear incident. He participated in volunteer emergency response training and expressed interest in pursuing a career in wilderness safety or wildlife management. The polar bear's death had been investigated by federal wildlife authorities as part of their ongoing research into polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions in the Arctic regions. The investigation revealed that the bear had indeed had previous encounters with human facilities, including unsuccessful attempts to access other oil installations in the Prudhoe Bay area. The research conducted on the bear's remains provided valuable information about polar bear intelligence, learning capabilities, and adaptive behaviors in response to increasing human activity in Arctic regions. The findings were published in scientific journals and used to develop improved management strategies for polar bear populations throughout Alaska and northern Canada. Frank followed the research with interest, learning more about the remarkable animal that had threatened his crew and ultimately changed his life. He developed a deep respect for polar bears as intelligent and adaptable predators, while maintaining appreciation for the importance of human safety measures in areas where the two species might interact. The Platform 7 facility resumed normal operations in February 2026, with enhanced security measures and modified procedures for wildlife management. No additional polar bear encounters occurred during the following year, suggesting that the security improvements had been effective in preventing similar incidents. However, wildlife officials noted that polar bear activity in the Prudhoe Bay area had increased significantly over the past several years, possibly due to climate change impacts on traditional hunting grounds and food sources. The trend suggested that human-wildlife conflicts would likely continue to increase, requiring ongoing improvements in security measures and emergency response capabilities. Frank's experience with the polar bear encounter influenced his perspective on environmental issues and climate change, leading him to become more engaged in conservation efforts and environmental education. He participated in community presentations about Arctic wildlife and the challenges facing both animals and humans in rapidly changing environmental conditions. The story of the Platform 7 polar bear encounter was eventually featured in a documentary film about human-wildlife conflicts in Alaska. Frank and several crew members were interviewed for the film, providing first-hand accounts of their experience and discussing the broader implications for Arctic operations and wildlife management. Margaret supported Frank's participation in educational and awareness activities related to the polar bear encounter, recognizing that his experience provided valuable lessons for others working in similar environments. She was proud of Frank's professional handling of the crisis and his willingness to share his knowledge with others who might face similar challenges. Frank's children grew up hearing detailed accounts of the polar bear encounter, learning about wilderness safety, emergency preparedness, and the importance of respecting wildlife while maintaining appropriate protective measures. The story became part of the family's shared history and contributed to their understanding of the challenges and rewards associated with work in Alaska's unique environment. As years passed, Frank remained grateful for having survived the polar bear encounter, while recognizing that the experience had fundamentally changed his priorities and life direction. The incident had demonstrated the unpredictable nature of life and the importance of being prepared for unexpected challenges while maintaining focus on what truly mattered most. The crew members who had shared the Platform 7 polar bear experience maintained contact over the years, bonding over their shared memory of professional competence under extreme pressure. They occasionally gathered for reunions where they would retell the story and discuss how the experience had influenced their subsequent life choices and career decisions. Frank's transition from high-risk oilfield work to safer employment closer to home proved to be one of the most positive decisions of his life. While he occasionally missed the excitement and camaraderie of platform operations, he never regretted choosing family stability over maximum income and professional adventure. The polar bear that had threatened Frank and his crew had weighed over 1,300 pounds and had lived approximately 15 years in the harsh Arctic environment. Wildlife biologists estimated that the animal had successfully hunted seals and other prey across thousands of square miles of ice and tundra, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability and intelligence that had made it such a formidable adversary during the Platform 7 encounter. Frank often reflected on the bear's persistence and problem-solving abilities, recognizing that humans and polar bears shared certain characteristics, including intelligence, adaptability, and determination to survive in challenging environments. The encounter had been a confrontation between two species that were remarkably similar in their refusal to be easily defeated by obstacles or threats. The enhanced security measures implemented at Platform 7 and other Arctic facilities represented a new understanding of the capabilities and behavioral patterns of polar bears in areas with increasing human activity. The measures were expensive but necessary investments in worker safety and operational continuity. Frank's story became part of the oral tradition of Alaska's oil industry, passed down from experienced workers to newcomers as an example of the unexpected challenges that could arise in the Arctic environment. The story emphasized the importance of training, teamwork, and adherence to safety procedures, while acknowledging that some situations required real-time decision-making beyond the scope of any manual or protocol. The Platform 7 polar bear encounter remained the most significant wildlife-related incident in the history of Alaska's North Slope oil operations. The incident prompted industry-wide reviews of security measures and emergency procedures, leading to substantial improvements in worker safety and wildlife management protocols throughout the region. Frank Miller's professional handling of the crisis and his crew's disciplined response to the emergency became a benchmark for emergency management in the oil industry. Training programs throughout Alaska and other Arctic regions used the Platform 7 incident as a case study for effective leadership and teamwork under extreme pressure. Years later, as Frank watched his children graduate from college and begin their own careers, he remained grateful for the polar bear encounter that had forced him to reevaluate his priorities and choose family over maximum income. The incident had been terrifying and dangerous, but it had ultimately led to a more balanced and fulfilling life. The Arctic environment where Frank had worked for 18 years continued to change as climate patterns shifted and human activity increased. Polar bears and other wildlife faced increasing challenges as their traditional habitats were altered by warming temperatures and expanding industrial operations. Frank's experience provided him with unique insights into the complex relationships between human economic activity and wildlife conservation in fragile Arctic ecosystems. He used those insights to become an advocate for responsible development practices that could provide economic benefits while minimizing impacts on wildlife populations. The story of the Platform 7 polar bear encounter served as a reminder that humans were visitors in the Arctic environment, guests in a land that belonged to creatures perfectly adapted to survive in conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. The encounter had been a collision between two worlds, resolved through human technology, but leaving lasting impressions on all who had witnessed it. Frank Miller's journey from oilfield roughneck to family man and environmental advocate had been catalyzed by 1,300 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and instinct that had refused to be deterred by fences, lights, or human presence. The polar bear had lost the immediate confrontation, but it had won a larger victory by forcing Frank to recognize what truly mattered in his life. The memory of that December night when a massive predator had stalked through his facility would remain with Frank for the rest of his life, a reminder of the power and unpredictability of the natural world, and the importance of respecting both its beauty and its dangers. The encounter had ended in tragedy for the bear, but it had led to a better life for Frank and his family, and ultimately to a greater understanding of the delicate balance between human ambition and natural forces in one of the world's most challenging and magnificent environments. The polar bear had come to Platform 7 seeking something that Frank would never fully understand, but its visit had provided Frank with insights and perspective that would guide him through the rest of his life. The encounter had been brief but profound, changing the trajectory of multiple lives and serving as a powerful reminder of the unexpected ways that wildlife and humans intersect in the modern world. In the end, the story of the Platform 7 polar bear was not just about a wildlife encounter gone wrong, but about the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, the importance of preparation and teamwork in crisis situations, and the ongoing challenge of coexisting with magnificent and dangerous predators in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. Frank Miller had survived his encounter with one of nature's most formidable predators. But more importantly, he had learned from it, grown from it, and used it to build a better life for himself and his family. The polar bear's legacy lived on not just in training manuals and safety procedures, but in the improved life choices and deeper appreciation for family and nature that had resulted from that terrifying December night when the Arctic's greatest predator had come calling at Platform 7. The next stories, the last stand. The morning mist clung to the Bitterroot Valley like a shroud, obscuring the jagged peaks that surrounded the Hughes family ranch. Scott Hughes stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the fog roll across his pastures where his prize Angus cattle grazed peacefully. At 52, Scott had weathered more storms than most men twice his age. Drought, market crashes, the death of his wife 3 years prior. But he'd never lost his love for this unforgiving land. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of some of the most beautiful and dangerous territory in western Montana. The property bordered the Cabinet Yaak Wilderness, where grizzly bears roamed freely through dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Scott had chosen this location deliberately 30 years ago when he'd married Sarah and decided to build their dream together. The isolation meant they were truly alone with nature, but it also meant they were vulnerable to nature's darker impulses. "Dad, you see those tracks by the north pasture fence?" Scott turned to see his daughter Emma entering the kitchen, her boots still muddy from her morning inspection of the property. At 28, Emma had inherited her mother's auburn hair and fierce determination, along with Scott's practical wisdom about ranch life. She'd returned home after completing her veterinary degree, drawn back by the same inexplicable pull that kept the Hughes family rooted to this remote corner of Montana. "What kind of tracks?" Scott asked, though something in Emma's tone already had his stomach tightening with unease. "Big ones. Claws longer than my fingers. Whatever made them was walking the fence line like it was testing for weak spots." Emma poured herself coffee from the pot, her movements deliberate but tense. "I took pictures with my phone, but Dad, I think we might have a problem." Scott set down his mug and studied his daughter's face. Emma had grown up on this ranch, had seen black bear sign dozens of times, had even encountered a few bears at a safe distance, but something in her expression told him this was different. "Show me," he said simply. They walked together across the dew-soaked grass toward the north pasture, where Scott's prize breeding stock grazed in blissful ignorance of any threat. The fence line ran for nearly a quarter-mile along the edge of the forest, separating domestic tranquility from the untamed wilderness beyond. As they approached the spot Emma had indicated, Scott felt his breath catch in his throat. The tracks were enormous, easily 7 inches long, with claw marks extending another 3 inches beyond the pad marks. The bear had walked deliberately along the fence, occasionally pressing against the posts to test their stability. At one point, the creature had reared up on its hind legs, leaving scratches on a fence post nearly 8 feet off the ground. "Jesus," Scott whispered, kneeling beside the clearest print. "This is a big grizzly, really big." Emma nodded grimly. "I measured it. The pad alone is nearly 8 inches across. Fish and Wildlife says an average male grizzly has a pad around 6 inches. This thing could be pushing 800 pounds, maybe more." Scott stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and scanned the tree line. Somewhere in that dense forest, a massive predator was studying his ranch, learning his routines, evaluating his livestock as potential prey. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "We need to call the authorities," Emma said, but Scott was already shaking his head. "You know what they'll tell us. It's bear country. Take precautions. Call if you have an actual encounter. They won't do anything until something happens." Scott's voice carried the weight of experience with bureaucratic indifference. "In the meantime, I've got 18 head of cattle in that pasture, worth more than most people make in 2 years. Emma understood her father's dilemma. The cattle represented not just financial investment, but the culmination of decades of careful breeding and husbandry. Each animal was registered, tracked, and valued not just in dollars, but in genetic potential for future generations. Losing even one would be devastating. Losing multiple animals could bankrupt the ranch. "So what do we do?" Emma asked. Scott studied the tracks again, his mind racing through possibilities. "We reinforce the fence. Double the height if we have to, install motion sensors and floodlights, and we move the cattle closer to the house until this bear moves on." It was a reasonable plan, the kind of measured response that had kept the Hughes family safe and prosperous for 3 decades. But as they walked back toward the house, neither Scott nor Emma noticed the massive shadow that detached itself from the tree line and began following their path, staying just inside the forest edge where the morning mist provided perfect concealment. The bear was indeed enormous, a male grizzly approaching the end of his prime, but still possessing terrible strength and intelligence sharpened by 30 years of survival in some of the harshest country on earth. His fur was the color of burnished copper, with silver tips that gave him an almost ethereal appearance in the filtered sunlight. Scars crisscrossed his massive frame, testament to battles with other bears, encounters with humans, and the constant struggle for dominance in an unforgiving ecosystem. This bear, known to wildlife biologists as Bear 341, but never successfully tagged or tracked, had learned to associate human settlements with easy food sources. Unlike his wild brethren who fled at the first sign of human presence, 341 had developed a dangerous fearlessness that made him extraordinarily dangerous. He had killed livestock before, had been suspected in the disappearance of several hikers over the years, and had grown large and confident by exploiting the interface between civilization and wilderness. Now, 341 watched the humans return to their dwelling, his small dark eyes missing nothing. He had been observing this ranch for weeks, learning the routines, counting the prey animals, evaluating the defenses. The cattle were fat and slow, confined within barriers that would pose no obstacle to a creature of his size and strength. The humans carried no visible weapons, moved without the alertness of prey animals, seemed blissfully unaware of their vulnerability. The bear's stomach rumbled with hunger. The summer salmon runs had been poor, berry crops had failed due to drought, and the small game that usually sustained him through the lean months had become increasingly scarce. The cattle represented not just a meal, but survival through the coming winter. And if the humans interfered with his feeding, well, 341 had dealt with human interference before. As Scott and Emma disappeared into their house, the bear emerged fully from the tree line and approached the fence with deliberate purpose. The metal posts groaned under his weight as he tested them systematically, probing for weaknesses with the methodical intelligence that had made him the apex predator in this valley. Finding the fence strong but not insurmountable, 341 settled back on his haunches and began his vigil, waiting for darkness and the opportunity to claim what he had already decided was his. Inside the house, Scott was making phone calls to neighbors and suppliers, trying to arrange for additional fencing materials and motion-activated lights. Emma had pulled up bear safety information on her laptop, cross-referencing the track measurements with wildlife databases to confirm their assessment of the animal's size. The data was sobering. A male grizzly of the size they were dealing with would have no natural predators other than humans, would be capable of outrunning a horse for short distances, and would possess the strength to snap a steer's neck with a single swipe of his paw. "Dad," Emma called from the computer, "I'm looking at the state wildlife database. There haven't been any grizzly sightings reported in this area for over 2 years. The nearest confirmed population is supposed to be 50 miles north of here." Scott paused in his conversation with the hardware store owner. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this bear either traveled a very long way to get here, or he's been living in our area without anyone knowing about it. Either way, he's not just passing through, he's established himself here." The implication hung in the air between them. A bear that had made their valley his territory would not be easily discouraged. He would return repeatedly, would become increasingly bold, and would eventually pose a direct threat to their lives as well as their livelihood. Scott finished his call and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Tommy Brennan says he can bring fence materials out this afternoon. I also called Jack Morrison. He's willing to help us string new wire and install the sensors." Jack Morrison was a neighbor whose ranch lay 5 miles east of the Hughes property. At 45, Jack was a Vietnam veteran who had found peace in the Montana wilderness after the war, but who retained the tactical awareness and steady nerves that had kept him alive in the jungle. His assistance would be invaluable, but it also meant admitting that the situation was beyond what Scott could handle alone. "What about weapons?" Emma asked quietly. Scott looked at his daughter for a long moment. They kept rifles on the ranch for predator control and hunting, but both of them knew that shooting a grizzly bear was legally complicated and practically dangerous. Wounded bears were notorious for their ability to continue fighting despite fatal injuries, and a bear the size they were dealing with would require perfect shot placement to stop immediately. "The 36 is in the gun safe," Scott said finally, "but Emma, I hope to God we don't need it." By afternoon, Jack Morrison had arrived with his pickup truck loaded with fence posts and wire, along with his 19-year-old son, Danny, who was home from college for the weekend. Danny Morrison was studying wildlife biology at the University of Montana, and his presence proved fortuitous when he examined the bear tracks and confirmed their worst fears. "This is definitely a mature male," Danny said, crouched beside the clearest print. "Look at the spacing between the front and rear paw prints. This bear's stride is over 3 feet long. That suggests an animal in the 800-pound range, maybe bigger." Jack Morrison whistled low. "I've seen a lot of bears over the years, but never one that big. The bigger they get, the more dangerous they become," Danny continued. "A bear this size would have no fear of humans. In fact, he might see us as competitors rather than threats." The 4 of them spent the afternoon reinforcing the fence line, adding a second tier of wire mesh and installing battery-powered motion sensors at 50-foot intervals. The work was exhausting in the autumn heat, but all of them understood the urgency. With each passing hour, the likelihood of a nocturnal visit from their unwelcome neighbor increased. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Scott made the decision to move the cattle into the barn for the night. The barn was a massive structure built from local timber and reinforced with steel supports. It had sheltered the Hughes family's livestock through countless storms and harsh winters. Scott was confident it would provide adequate protection against even a determined grizzly bear. The cattle, sensing their handler's anxiety, moved restlessly as they were herded into the barn. Livestock possessed an intuitive awareness of predators that often exceeded human perception, and Scott noticed that several of his prize bulls were snorting and pawing the ground, their eyes white with fear. Whatever had visited their pasture had left scent markers that still terrified these domesticated descendants of wild aurochs. "Easy, Thunder," Scott murmured to his lead bull, a magnificent Angus that had sired dozens of calves over his 8-year lifespan. "We'll keep you safe." But as he secured the barn doors, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that he was merely postponing an inevitable confrontation. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a 800-pound predator was stirring, preparing for his nightly hunt, and all the fences and barriers in the world might not be enough to stop him. Emma checked the motion sensors one final time, ensuring the batteries were fresh and the detection angles were properly calibrated. The devices would trigger powerful LED floodlights if anything larger than a raccoon approached the barn, and would also send alerts to the receivers they carried in the house. It was a sophisticated early warning system, but Emma found herself wondering if it would provide enough advance notice to matter. Jack and Danny Morrison stayed for dinner, and the conversation inevitably turned to bear behavior and defensive strategies. Danny, despite his youth, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of grizzly biology that proved both fascinating and terrifying. "The thing about big males like this," Danny explained over Emma's homemade chili, "is that they're incredibly intelligent. They learn from every encounter, remember every human response, and adapt their behavior accordingly. If this bear has been successful in the past at taking livestock, he'll have developed specific techniques for overcoming human defenses." "What kind of techniques?" Scott asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Some bears learn to approach from downwind to avoid triggering scent-based deterrents. Others will probe defenses systematically, testing different entry points until they find weakness. The really smart ones will create diversions, making noise in one area to draw human attention while they attack from another direction." Jack Morrison set down his coffee cup with a grim expression. "Sounds like you're describing military tactics." "In a way, I am," Danny replied. "Large predators are essentially biological warfare specialists. They've evolved to overcome the defenses of prey animals, and unfortunately, our domestic livestock have lost most of their defensive instincts through selective breeding." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden electronic chirping from the motion sensor receivers. All 4 of them froze as the sound echoed through the kitchen. Then Scott was moving toward the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the barn. The floodlights had activated, bathing the area around the barn in harsh white light. At first, Scott saw nothing unusual, just empty ground and the familiar outline of his farm buildings. Then, at the very edge of the illuminated area, something massive moved through the shadows. "There," Emma whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "Do you see it?" The bear emerged into the light with no apparent concern for the sudden illumination. In the harsh glare of the LED floods, Bear 341 appeared even larger than his tracks had suggested, a mountain of muscle and fur that moved with surprising grace despite his enormous size. The light reflected off his small dark eyes, giving him an almost supernatural appearance as he studied the barn and its human-made defenses. "Dear God," Jack Morrison breathed, "that thing's the size of a small car." The bear approached the barn methodically, testing the newly installed fence with deliberate pressure from his massive paws. The metal posts groaned under his weight but held firm, and after several minutes of probing, the bear stepped back and began circling the structure, clearly evaluating alternative approaches. "He's learning our defenses," Danny said quietly. "Watch how methodical he is. This isn't random behavior. He's conducting reconnaissance." For nearly an hour, the 4 humans watched in fascination and growing terror as the bear conducted his inspection. He tested every section of fencing, examined the barn walls for potential weakness, and even reared up on his hind legs to investigate the roofline. Throughout his inspection, the cattle inside the barn grew increasingly agitated, their low moos of distress clearly audible even through the thick walls. Finally, apparently satisfied with his reconnaissance, the bear withdrew to the tree line and vanished into the darkness. The motion sensors continued to chirp occasionally as smaller animals, deer, raccoons, possibly coyotes, moved through the detection zones. But the massive presence that had dominated the landscape was gone. "Is it over?" Emma asked. Danny shook his head. "He'll be back. Maybe not tonight, but soon. And next time, he'll have a plan." Jack Morrison stood and reached for his jacket. "Scott, I think Danny and I should stay the night. If that bear decides to make his move, you'll need all the help you can get." Scott wanted to refuse. The Hughes family had always been fiercely independent, reluctant to impose on neighbors even in times of crisis. But as he looked out at the empty landscape, where an 800-pound predator had vanished like a ghost, he realized that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I'd appreciate that, Jack." "Danny, you can take the guest room." "Jack, there's a pull-out couch in the den." They established a watch schedule, 2-hour shifts that would ensure someone was always monitoring the motion sensors and watching for signs of the bear's return. Scott took the first watch, sitting at the kitchen table with his rifle across his knees and a thermos of coffee at his elbow. Through the window, he could see the barn, standing like a fortress in the artificial daylight of the security floods, his livestock safe for the moment, but essentially under siege. At 2 a.m., Jack Morrison relieved Scott, taking up position with the practiced alertness of a man who had spent many nights watching for a very different kind of predator in a very different wilderness. Jack's watch passed quietly, broken only by the occasional deer moving through the detection zones and the distant howl of coyotes in the surrounding hills. Danny took the 4 a.m. watch, his young eyes sharp despite the early hour. It was during his shift that the motion sensors began chirping with increasing frequency, indicating movement throughout the property. At first, Danny assumed it was simply the normal parade of nocturnal wildlife that inhabited the valley, but gradually he realized that the patterns were wrong. The sensors were triggering in sequence, suggesting that something large was moving systematically around the perimeter of the property. Whatever it was remained just outside the range of the floodlights, but it was clearly conducting another reconnaissance mission, this time more thorough than the first. Danny woke the others quietly, and they gathered at the kitchen window to watch the ghostly progression of sensor activations that marked the bear's passage. Like points of light on a tactical display, the sensors illuminated one by one as Bear 341 completed his circuit of the ranch buildings, probing for weaknesses, memorizing every detail of the human defenses. "He's planning something," Emma whispered. "Look at how systematic he is." The bear's inspection lasted until dawn, when the rising sun finally sent him melting back into the forest shadows. As morning light flooded the valley, the 4 humans emerged from the house to examine their property for signs of the night's visitor. What they found was sobering. The bear had indeed conducted a thorough reconnaissance, leaving massive paw prints in the soft earth around every building on the ranch. He had tested fences, examined doors and windows, and even investigated the vehicles parked near the house. Most disturbing of all, he had approached to within 20 feet of the house itself, close enough to have seen the humans watching from the windows. "He's not afraid of us," Scott said grimly. "That's the most dangerous thing of all." Danny was examining the tracks near the barn, using a measuring tape to confirm the bear's dimensions. "Dad, look at this," he called to Jack. "The spacing between his front paws is over 4 feet. This bear is not just big, he's enormous. I'm revising my estimate upward. This animal could be pushing 900 pounds. The implications were staggering. A grizzly bear of that size would be capable of breaking through virtually any barrier that might be feasibly constructed on a ranch. Worse, such a large bear would require enormous amounts of food to sustain himself, making him increasingly desperate and dangerous as winter approached. "We need professional help," Emma said. "This is beyond what we can handle ourselves." Scott nodded reluctantly. "I'll call the Fish and Wildlife Service." Maybe they can relocate him, but when Scott made the call, the response was predictably bureaucratic. The Fish and Wildlife agent explained that relocation was extremely expensive and rarely successful with large male bears, who typically returned to their established territory or became problem animals in their new location. Without evidence of actual livestock kills or human attacks, the agency could offer little more than advice and moral support. "So, we're on our own," Scott said after ending the call. Jack Morrison lit a cigarette and studied the forest edge where the bear had vanished. "Not necessarily. I know a guy who might be able to help. Name's Robert Clearwater. He's Blackfeet Tribal Police, but he also works as a problem bear specialist. If anyone can deal with this situation, it's him." Robert Clearwater arrived that afternoon, driving a modified pickup truck equipped with specialized bear handling equipment. At 55, he was a compact, weathered man whose dark eyes seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. His expertise in bear behavior was legendary throughout Montana, earned through decades of dealing with problem animals on the Blackfeet Reservation. Clearwater examined the tracks and listened to their account of the previous night's events with the focused attention of a man who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. "This is Bear 341, he said finally. "I've been tracking him for 3 years. He's killed livestock on 6 different ranches, probably killed at least 2 hikers, and he's getting bolder every year." "You know this specific bear?" Emma asked. "Oh, yes. 341 is famous in certain circles. He's the largest grizzly anyone's seen in this region for decades, and he's learned to exploit human settlements with surgical precision. The problem is that he's too smart to be trapped and too dangerous to relocate. Every attempt to capture him has failed." Scott felt his stomach tighten. "So, what are our options?" Clearwater was quiet for a long moment, studying the massive paw prints that surrounded the barn. "Honestly, your best option is to sell your cattle and leave this valley. 341 has claimed this territory, and he won't be discouraged by fences or lights or noisemakers. He'll keep coming back until he gets what he wants." "This is our home," Scott said firmly. "Our livelihood. We can't just abandon everything we've built." "Then you're going to have to kill him," Clearwater said bluntly, "and that's going to be a lot harder than you think." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Killing a grizzly bear in Montana required special permits and could result in serious legal consequences if not properly documented. More practically, killing a bear the size of 341 would require exceptional skill, perfect conditions, and a considerable amount of luck. "What would it take?" Jack Morrison asked. Clearwater studied each of them in turn, evaluating their resolve and capabilities. "First, you'd need the right weapon. That .30-06 might not be enough for a bear this size. You'd want something with more stopping power, a .375 or larger. Second, you'd need perfect shot placement. A wounded bear this size would be essentially unstoppable until he bled out, and that could take several minutes. Third, you'd need to catch him in the open where you could guarantee a clean shot." "And if we wound him," Emma asked, "then he becomes 10 times more dangerous. A wounded grizzly is the most dangerous animal on Earth. He'll attack anything that moves, and he won't stop until he's dead." The conversation was interrupted by another sequence of motion sensor alerts. This time, however, the bear appeared in broad daylight, emerging from the forest with no attempt at concealment. Bear 341 walked directly to the barn and began testing the reinforced fence line with methodical determination. Jesus, Jack Morrison whispered. He's not even trying to hide. Clearwater watched the bear's behavior with professional interest. He's done learning. Now he's ready to act. The bear's inspection was brief, but thorough. He tested several fence posts, examined the barn doors, and then did something that chilled every human observer to the bone. He looked directly at the house windows where they were watching, making deliberate eye contact across 50 yards of open ground. "He knows we're here," Emma said. "He's not afraid of us at all." "More than that," Clearwater replied grimly. "He's challenging us. This is his territory now, and he's giving us one last chance to leave voluntarily." The bear held their gaze for nearly a full minute, then turned and walked back into the forest with the unhurried confidence of an apex predator who feared nothing on earth. "Tonight," Clearwater said quietly. "He'll make his move tonight." The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Clearwater had brought additional weapons, a .375H and H rifle, and a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with special bear slugs. He also carried tranquilizer equipment, though he explained that chemical immobilization of a bear this size was extremely dangerous and should only be attempted as a last resort. They positioned themselves strategically around the property as darkness fell. Clearwater took position in the hayloft of the barn, where he would have clear sight lines in multiple directions. Jack Morrison positioned himself near the house with the shotgun, while Scott and Emma maintained watch from the kitchen windows with the .3006. Danny Morrison had been sent home despite his protests. Clearwater explained that the upcoming confrontation would be too dangerous for anyone without extensive experience with dangerous wildlife. The first motion sensor alert came at 11:30 p.m., but this time there was no ghostly progression around the property perimeter. Instead, multiple sensors triggered simultaneously, indicating that something very large was moving directly toward the barn through the open pasture. Bear 341 approached with no attempt at stealth, walking across the moonlit grass with the confident stride of a creature that had already decided the outcome of the night's events. In the harsh glare of the security floods, he appeared even more massive than before, a walking mountain of muscle and fury that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The bear reached the fence line and began his assault immediately. Rather than testing for weaknesses, he simply began tearing through the reinforced barriers with brute strength that defied comprehension. Metal posts bent under his assault, and wire mesh parted like tissue paper before his massive claws. Inside the barn, the cattle began screaming, a sound unlike anything Scott had ever heard from domestic livestock. It was pure terror, the primal recognition of a predator so ancient and deadly that even these heavily domesticated animals retained genetic memories of his kind. "Take the shot," Scott called to Clearwater over the radio. "No clear angle," came the reply. "He's too close to the barn." "If I miss, the bullet could ricochet and hit the livestock." Bear 341 completed his demolition of the fence and approached the barn doors. The massive wooden barriers that had withstood decades of Montana weather groaned under his assault as he began tearing them apart with his claws. The sound was like a buzzsaw cutting through timber, punctuated by the bear's huffing exhalations and the increasingly frantic cries of the trapped cattle. "He's breaking through," Emma reported, watching through binoculars. "The door won't hold much longer." Inside the barn, pandemonium erupted as Bear 341 forced his way through the destroyed entrance. The cattle, trapped in their stalls, could only wait in terror as death approached with deliberate purpose. The bear's strategy became immediately apparent. Rather than taking one animal and fleeing, he intended to kill as many as possible, establishing dominance over the territory through overwhelming force. The first steer died with a wet crunch as the bear's massive jaws closed around its throat. The second fell to a swipe of claws that opened its flank from shoulder to hip. Within minutes, the barn had become a slaughterhouse, filled with the sounds of dying animals and the terrible huffing satisfaction of the bear as he killed. "I have to try the shot," Clearwater radioed. "He's killing everything." "Wait," Scott replied, grabbing his rifle. "I'm going in there." "Scott, no!" Emma grabbed her father's arm. "You'll be killed." But Scott Hughes was beyond rational thought. These were his animals, his livelihood, the product of decades of careful breeding and husbandry. He couldn't simply hide in his house while they were slaughtered. Scott burst through the kitchen door and ran across the open ground toward the barn, his rifle ready. Behind him, he could hear Emma calling his name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. All of his attention was focused on the massive silhouette visible through the destroyed barn entrance. Bear 341 looked up from his killing as Scott approached, blood dripping from his muzzle and front paws. For a moment, predator and human evaluated each other across 20 feet of blood-soaked barn floor. Then the bear rose to his full height on his hind legs, towering nearly 10 feet tall, and issued a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Scott raised his rifle and fired. The .30-06 bullet struck the bear center mass, exactly where Scott had aimed. On a normal-sized bear, it would have been a killing shot. On Bear 341, it merely served to transform him from a methodical killer into an enraged engine of destruction. The bear dropped to all fours and charged with speed that seemed impossible for something so massive. Scott had time for one more shot, which went high as the bear's charge threw off his aim, and then 800 pounds of fury slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Scott's world exploded into pain and confusion as the bear's claws raked across his chest and the massive jaws sought his throat. His ribs cracked under the crushing weight, and he felt, rather than heard, his left arm break as the bear's jaws closed around it. Through the red haze of agony, he could hear gunfire from multiple directions as his rescuers tried to save him. Clearwater's .375 boomed from the hayloft, the heavy bullet striking the bear in the shoulder and spinning him partially away from Scott. Jack Morrison's shotgun roared repeatedly as he charged into the barn, the bear slug striking the massive animal in the flanks and rear legs. But Bear 341 was far from finished. Even with multiple bullet wounds, he retained enough strength to bat Jack Morrison aside like a rag doll, sending the veteran flying into a stall post with bone-crushing force. Emma arrived with the rifle, firing repeatedly at point-blank range, but the bear seemed to absorb the bullets without significant effect. It was Clearwater who finally ended the nightmare. The tribal police officer had worked his way down from the hayloft and managed to get within 10 feet of the bear's head. When 341 turned toward this new threat, Clearwater placed his final 375 round precisely at the base of the bear's skull, severing the spinal cord and dropping the massive predator instantly. The sudden silence that followed was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. Bear 341 lay motionless amid the carnage he had created, his massive frame finally still. Around him, the barn looked like a war zone, destroyed stalls, dead and dying cattle, and 3 seriously injured humans. Scott was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Jack Morrison was trying to sit up despite obvious internal injuries. Emma, miraculously, had escaped with only minor cuts and bruises, though she was in severe shock from witnessing the attack. Clearwater immediately began first aid while calling for emergency medical helicopters on his radio. The nearest hospital was 60 miles away, over mountain roads that would take hours to traverse by ambulance. If the injured men were to survive, they would need immediate evacuation by air. "This is Clearwater requesting immediate medical helicopter to the Hughes Ranch. Coordinates." His voice was calm and professional despite the chaos around him, the result of decades of experience with violent wildlife encounters. The medical helicopters arrived 40 minutes later, their searchlights turning night into day as they landed in the ranch's largest pasture. EMTs worked frantically to stabilize Scott and Jack before loading them into the aircraft for transport to the trauma center in Missoula. Emma rode with her father, holding his hand and talking to him continuously, even though he remained unconscious. Scott's injuries were severe: multiple broken ribs, a punctured lung, a shattered left arm, and massive tissue damage from the bear's claws. The EMTs worked to keep him alive during the flight, but his condition remained critical. Jack Morrison's injuries were different but equally serious. The impact with the stall post had caused internal bleeding and possible spinal damage. He remained conscious during the flight, but his legs showed no response to stimuli, suggesting that his back might be broken. At the hospital, both men were rushed into emergency surgery, while Emma waited in the trauma center's family room, still wearing clothes stained with blood and barn dust. Clearwater had remained at the ranch to secure the scene and document the incident for his official report, but he had promised to join her at the hospital as soon as possible. The surgeries lasted through the night. Scott's procedure involved repairing his punctured lung, setting his shattered arm with metal plates and screws, and cleaning and suturing the massive claw wounds that crisscrossed his chest and back. The surgeons warned Emma that infection was a major concern. Bear claws carried bacteria that could cause life-threatening sepsis if not treated aggressively. Jack Morrison's surgery was even more complex. The impact had fractured 2 vertebrae in his lower back, and bone fragments had damaged his spinal cord. The surgeons were able to stabilize the fractures and remove most of the fragments, but they could not predict whether he would ever walk again. Dawn was breaking over the Bitterroot Valley when the surgeons finally emerged to speak with Emma. Both men had survived their operations, but their conditions remained serious. Scott was on a ventilator due to his lung injury, and Jack was paralyzed from the waist down, though the doctors held out hope that some function might return as the swelling around his spinal cord decreased. "Your father is a tough man," the lead surgeon told Emma. "The next 48 hours will be critical, but I think he's going to make it." The bigger concern is infection from the claw wounds. "We've started him on massive doses of antibiotics, but bear attacks often lead to serious bacterial infections." Emma nodded numbly, trying to process the medical information while dealing with her own trauma from witnessing the attack. She had seen her father, the strongest man she knew, broken and helpless, in the jaws of a creature that seemed to embody pure malevolence. Clearwater arrived at the hospital that afternoon, bringing news from the ranch and official documentation of the incident. The bear's carcass had been examined by state wildlife biologists who confirmed that it was indeed the largest grizzly bear ever recorded in that region of Montana. Bear 341 had weighed 847 pounds, nearly as large as the massive coastal brown bears of Alaska. "The good news is that Fish and Wildlife is calling this a justified killing," Clearwater told Emma. "Given the livestock losses and the attack on humans, there won't be any legal consequences. The bad news is that the damage to your ranch is extensive." Emma learned that Bear 341 had killed 14 head of cattle during his rampage, with 4 more animals so severely injured that they had to be euthanized. The financial losses exceeded $80,000, not including the damage to barn structures and fencing. For a small ranch operation, it was a potentially devastating blow. "What about insurance?" Emma asked. Clearwater shook his head. "Most livestock insurance policies exclude predator kills. You might be able to get some compensation from the state's predator loss program, but it won't cover anything close to your actual losses." Over the following days, as Scott slowly recovered consciousness and began the long process of healing, Emma learned to navigate the complex bureaucracy surrounding wildlife conflicts. The state offered modest compensation for confirmed livestock losses, but the paperwork was extensive and the reimbursement rates were far below market value. Local media picked up the story, turning the Hughes Ranch into a temporary circus of reporters and photographers eager to document the aftermath of such a dramatic predator attack. Emma found herself giving interviews about her father's condition and the ranch's future, trying to balance honesty about their losses with hope for recovery. "This has been our home for 30 years, she told a reporter from the Missoulian. "One bear isn't going to drive us away, but it's certainly changed how we'll have to operate going forward." Scott remained hospitalized for 2 weeks, fighting off 2 separate infections before his body finally began to heal. The claw wounds left permanent scars across his chest and back, and his left arm never regained full mobility despite extensive physical therapy. More significantly, the attack had changed him psychologically. He became hypervigilant about sounds outside at night, startled easily, and struggled with nightmares about the bear. Jack Morrison's recovery was more complicated. The spinal cord damage proved to be permanent, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The proud, independent rancher who had charged into mortal danger to save his neighbor now faced life in a wheelchair, dependent on others for basic mobility. Emma threw herself into managing both her father's recovery and the ranch's reconstruction. The barn had to be largely rebuilt with new doors and reinforced walls. She invested in more sophisticated security systems, including thermal cameras and automated alert systems that would provide earlier warning of approaching predators. The surviving cattle were moved to a different pasture, closer to the house, and Emma hired 2 ranch hands to provide additional security during the vulnerable overnight hours. The costs were substantial, but she was determined to prove that the family ranch could survive and prosper despite the tragedy. 3 months after the attack, Scott was finally able to return home, though he remained physically limited and emotionally fragile. He spent long hours sitting on the porch, staring out at the forest edge where Bear 341 had emerged to claim his territory. Emma worried about her father's mental state, but she also understood that healing from such trauma would take time. "Sometimes I dream about him," Scott told Emma one evening as they watched the sunset paint the western peaks gold and crimson. "Not the attack itself, but before that. I dream about watching him in the forest, and he's watching me back, like we were sizing each other up for what was coming." Emma took her father's scarred hand in hers. "It's over, Dad. He's gone, and we're still here." "Are we?" Scott asked quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if he didn't win after all. Look what he took from us. The cattle, the money, Jack's legs, my peace of mind. Maybe driving us crazy was his real victory." It was a sobering thought, and one that Emma struggled with as she worked to rebuild their operation. The ranch continued to function, but it operated under a shadow of fear that had never existed before. Every sound from the forest drew worried glances. Every motion sensor alert triggered an adrenaline response, and the simple act of checking on livestock after dark had become an exercise in controlled terror. The wider community had rallied around the Hughes family, with neighbors contributing money, labor, and moral support. But Emma knew that sympathy could only carry them so far. Ultimately, they would have to prove that they could operate profitably and safely in territory that had been claimed by one of nature's most formidable predators. A year after the attack, Emma organized a memorial service for the lost cattle and a celebration of the family's survival. Local ranchers, wildlife officials, and media representatives gathered at the rebuilt barn to commemorate the event that had changed all their lives. Clearwater spoke about the complex relationship between humans and predators in the modern West, acknowledging that conflicts were inevitable as human development encroached on wildlife habitat. Scott, still bearing visible scars but stronger than he had been in months, talked about the importance of respecting the wilderness while refusing to be driven from the land his family called home. Bear 341 was a magnificent animal, Scott said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. He was just doing what bears do, trying to survive in a world that was changing around him. I don't hate him for what he did to us, but I also don't regret what we had to do to protect ourselves and our livelihood. Jack Morrison, attending in his wheelchair with his wife's assistance, spoke about the importance of community in times of crisis. His ranch was being managed by his son Danny, who had taken a leave of absence from college to help his father adapt to his new circumstances. "None of us could have survived this alone," Jack said. "It took all of us working together to get through the worst of it, and it's going to take all of us working together to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze plaque mounted on the rebuilt barn door, commemorating the events of that terrible night and honoring both the human and animal lives that had been lost. The plaque bore a simple inscription: "In memory of lives lost and lives forever changed. May we learn to share this land with wisdom and respect." As the crowd dispersed and the media crews packed their equipment, Emma stood alone in the barn, remembering the chaos and terror of that night. The new construction still smelled of fresh lumber and paint, a clean scent that masked the memories of blood and death that would always haunt this space. Bear 341's story had ended with his death, but the story of the Hughes Ranch continued. They had survived the ultimate test of their resolve and their connection to the land, emerging scarred but unbroken. In the years that followed, there would be other challenges: drought, market fluctuations, the normal hazards of ranch life, but none would ever again carry the existential terror of that October night when nature's most formidable predator had come calling. The wilderness beyond their pastures remained unchanged, still home to bears and wolves and all the other creatures that had inhabited this valley for millennia before humans arrived with their fences and cattle and electric lights. The difference now was that both predator and prey understood the true cost of conflict, and perhaps that understanding would make future encounters more cautious, more respectful, and less likely to end in tragedy. As Emma walked back to the house where her father waited, she could feel the weight of eyes watching from the forest edge. Not malevolent now, but curious, evaluating, deciding whether this partnership between human and wilderness could endure. Only time would tell whether the lessons learned in blood and terror would be enough to prevent history from repeating itself in this remote corner of Montana, where civilization met the wild. The next stories, The Last Trail. Catherine Morgan had always found peace in the wilderness. As a trauma nurse at Anchorage Regional Medical Center, she spent her days surrounded by the sterile walls of the hospital, tending to the broken and bleeding. The forest trails around Chugach State Park were her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe freely and let the weight of human suffering slip from her shoulders, if only temporarily. On this particular morning in late spring, the air carried the fresh scent of melting snow and new growth. Catherine adjusted the straps of her lightweight pack, checking her phone one last time before the signal would inevitably fade. 6:47 a.m. The parking area at the Powerline Pass trailhead was empty except for her silver Subaru and a lone pickup truck with mud-caked wheels. "Come on, Bear," she called to her chocolate Labrador, who was already straining against his leash, nose twitching at the myriad scents the morning offered. The irony of the dog's name had never been lost on her, especially here in Alaska, where the nickname took on a different meaning entirely. Catherine had moved to Anchorage 3 years ago, drawn by the promise of adventure and the generous pay that came with practicing medicine on the frontier. She'd grown up in suburban Portland, where the most dangerous wildlife she'd encountered were the occasional coyotes that wandered down from the hills. Alaska had been a shock to her system in more ways than one. The trail began as a wide, well-maintained path that had once been a service road for the power lines that crossed the valley. Catherine fell into the rhythm that had become second nature over countless morning hikes. steady, measured steps that could carry her for miles without fatigue. Bear trotted beside her, occasionally darting to investigate interesting smells, but always returning to heel when called. The morning was deceptively peaceful. Snow still clung to the higher elevations, creating a patchwork of white and green across the mountainsides. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath Catherine's hiking boots, Bear's panting, and the distant call of ravens echoing off the valley walls. What Catherine didn't know was that she was being watched. 200 yards ahead, hidden in a copse of stunted spruce trees, a massive grizzly bear stood motionless. At 8 feet tall and weighing nearly 600 pounds, the male bear was in his prime but desperately hungry. The winter had been longer than usual, and his typical food sources were still weeks away from full availability. The salmon runs wouldn't begin for months, and the berry bushes were barely budding. The bear had been following human scent trails for the past week, drawn by the promise of easy calories. Backpacks often contained food, and humans were soft, slow creatures. This particular human was alone, except for a dog, and the bear had learned that dogs could be dealt with quickly. Catherine was thinking about her shift that evening as she walked. The emergency department had been busy lately with the usual spring influx of tourists who overestimated their abilities in the wilderness. Just last week, they'd treated a hiker for severe hypothermia after he'd fallen through ice into a creek. The week before that, a climber with a compound fracture after a rappelling accident. She paused at a scenic overlook where the trail curved around a rocky outcropping. The view stretched across the valley to the Chugach Mountains beyond, their peaks still shrouded in morning mist. Catherine pulled out her phone to take a photo, forgetting that she'd already lost signal a mile back. Bear suddenly tensed beside her, his hackles rising. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound Catherine had never heard him make before. She looked down at her dog, then followed his gaze toward the tree line. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice instinctively dropping to barely audible levels. The forest seemed different now. The normal sounds of morning birds had stopped. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the branches had stilled. Catherine felt her pulse quicken as some primal part of her brain registered the wrongness of the silence. She began to back away slowly, one hand moving to the bear spray clipped to her belt. During her first month in Alaska, a veteran nurse had given her a piece of advice she'd never forgotten. In bear country, you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. Act accordingly. Bear's growl deepened, and Catherine saw what had triggered his alarm. About 50 yards ahead, a dark shape moved between the trees. At first she thought it might be a moose. They were common in the area and could be just as dangerous as bears. But as the shape emerged from the shadows, Catherine's blood turned to ice. The grizzly bear stood fully upright on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, its massive head swaying as it tested the air. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, with lighter tips that caught the morning sun. The bear's eyes, small and dark, fixed on Catherine with an intelligence that was terrifyingly focused. Time seemed to slow as Catherine processed what she was seeing. She'd been hiking in Alaska for 3 years and had seen bears before, usually black bears that fled as soon as they detected human presence. She'd seen grizzlies at a distance, through binoculars or from the safety of a car. But this was different. This bear wasn't running, it was evaluating. Catherine's training kicked in. Move slowly, don't run. Make yourself appear large. Speak in a calm, loud voice. Her hand found the safety cap on her bear spray, and she slowly removed it. Though her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the canister. "Hey, bear," she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Hey, bear, go away, I'm just passing through." The grizzly dropped to all fours with a heavy thud that Catherine could feel through the ground. For a moment she dared to hope it would turn and disappear back into the forest. Instead, it began walking toward her with a purposeful, measured gait. Bear, her dog, had stopped growling and was now pressing against Catherine's legs, trembling. She could feel his fear radiating through his body, and it amplified her own terror. Dogs were supposed to scare bears away, weren't they? That's what she'd read in all the wilderness safety guides. The grizzly was now 30 yards away and closing the distance steadily. Catherine began backing up more quickly, but the trail behind her was narrow with steep drop-offs on either side. There was nowhere to go but backward, and she could only move so fast without risking a fall that would leave her completely helpless. "Hey, bear! Go away!" she shouted louder, waving her free arm above her head. The bear spray was ready in her other hand, but she knew she had to wait until the bear was within 20 feet for it to be effective. 25 yards. 20 yards. The bear's expression was unreadable, but its body language spoke of determination. This wasn't a curious bear, or even an aggressive one defending territory. This was a predatory bear, and Catherine was prey. 15 yards. Catherine raised the bear spray, her finger on the trigger. "Go away! Get back!" The bear suddenly charged. The speed was incomprehensible. One moment the grizzly was 15 yards away, moving at what seemed like a walk. The next, it was covering ground faster than Catherine had ever seen anything move. She had perhaps 2 seconds to react. She pressed the trigger on the bear spray just as Bear, her dog, broke free from his leash and rushed toward the charging grizzly. The orange cloud of capsaicin erupted from the canister, but the morning breeze caught it and dispersed it before it could reach the bear. Catherine had time for one thought. She'd sprayed too early, before the grizzly reached her dog. The impact was horrific and mercifully brief. The bear's massive paw struck Bear with enough force to break the dog's neck instantly. Catherine heard the sound, a wet snap that would haunt her dreams if she lived to have them, and watched her companion's body fly through the air before hitting a tree with another sickening thud. The bear barely slowed down. Catherine turned to run, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself. Her hiking boots slipped on loose gravel as she scrambled backward, trying to get the bear spray positioned for another shot. The bear was on her before she could take 3 steps. The first blow knocked her to the ground. Catherine felt ribs crack as the bear's paw struck her torso, sending her tumbling across the rocky trail. Somehow, she managed to keep hold of the bear spray. She rolled onto her back and triggered another blast, just as the bear's massive head came down toward her. This time, the spray found its mark. The grizzly roared in pain and fury, shaking its head violently and pawing at its eyes. Catherine scrambled to her feet and ran, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side where her ribs had broken. She made it perhaps 20 yards before she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. The bear spray had slowed the animal but not stopped it. If anything, it seemed to have made the bear more enraged. Catherine's mind raced through her options as she ran. There were no trees large enough to climb effectively. The trail ahead curved around another rocky outcropping with steep sides. If she could reach it, maybe she could find a place to hide, or at least put some distance between herself and the bear. She never made it that far. The bear caught her at the narrowest part of the trail, where the path squeezed between 2 large boulders. Catherine felt the hot breath on her neck just before the claws raked across her back, shredding her jacket and the flesh beneath. She screamed and stumbled forward, crashing face first into the gravel. Rolling onto her back, Catherine found herself looking up at 600 pounds of enraged grizzly bear. The animal's eyes were streaming from the pepper spray, but its fury was undiminished. Catherine raised her arms to protect her face, just as the bear's jaws clamped down on her forearm. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. As a trauma nurse, Catherine had seen countless injuries, had treated bite wounds and maulings, but she'd never understood the sheer, overwhelming nature of being prey to a predator. The bear's teeth punched through her jacket sleeve and into the muscle and bone beneath, grinding with enough force to snap her radius and ulna like twigs. Catherine's scream echoed off the valley walls, a sound of pure agony that seemed to go on forever. The bear shook its head, worrying her arm like a dog with a chew toy, and Catherine felt her shoulder dislocate as her body was whipped back and forth. Through the haze of pain, Catherine's medical training tried to assert itself. Arterial bleeding, compound fractures, likely nerve damage. She was going into shock. She had minutes, maybe less, before blood loss rendered her unconscious. The bear released her arm and reared up on its hind legs again, preparing for what Catherine somehow knew would be the killing blow. Blood poured from the ragged wounds where the bear's teeth had torn through flesh and muscle. Her right arm hung useless at her side, bent at impossible angles. Time seemed to slow again as Catherine stared up at the massive predator. In that moment, she thought of her parents back in Portland, who had begged her not to move to Alaska. She thought of her colleagues at the hospital, who would wonder why she didn't show up for her shift. She thought of Bear, her faithful companion, whose body lay broken just yards away. The grizzly's roar filled the air as it came down toward her, claws extended, ready to end the encounter. Catherine closed her eyes and waited for death. The rifle shot cracked across the valley like thunder. The bear stumbled sideways, blood erupting from a wound in its shoulder. It roared again, this time in pain and confusion, spinning to face this new threat. "Get away from her!" a voice shouted from somewhere behind Catherine. "Get back!" Another shot and another. The bear took 2 more steps toward Catherine before its legs gave out. The massive animal collapsed less than 5 feet from where she lay bleeding on the trail. Catherine tried to turn her head to see her rescuer, but the movement sent waves of agony through her damaged body. She heard running footsteps on gravel, then a man's voice, closer now. "Jesus Christ," the voice said. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" Catherine managed to open her eyes. A bearded man in hunting clothes knelt beside her, his rifle still in his hands. His face was pale beneath his tan as he took in the extent of her injuries. I'm a nurse," Catherine whispered through lips that had gone numb with shock. "Radio, for help. I'm losing too much blood." The man, she would later learn his name was Robert Henley, a local hunting guide, was already reaching for the satellite communicator clipped to his belt. He'd been scouting elk sign when he heard her screams, following the sound until he found the bear attack in progress. "This is Robert Henley with emergency coordinates 61.1089, negative 149.5697. He spoke rapidly into the device. "I need immediate medical helicopter evacuation. Adult female, severe bear mauling, massive trauma to right arm, possible internal injuries. She's conscious, but losing blood fast." Catherine felt her vision starting to tunnel. The pain was fading, which she knew was a bad sign. Her body was shutting down, conserving blood flow to vital organs. She had seen this progression countless times in the emergency room. "Stay with me," Robert was saying, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "What's your name?" "Catherine Morgan," she managed. I work at Anchorage Regional, Emergency Department." Robert had removed his jacket and was using it to apply pressure to the worst of her wounds. "Help's coming, Catherine. You're going to be okay." But Catherine wasn't sure she believed him. She could feel her heart rate slowing, her breathing becoming shallow, the classic signs of hemorrhagic shock that she'd diagnosed in others dozens of times. She tried to estimate how much blood she'd lost based on the growing pool beneath her, but her thoughts were becoming fuzzy. The sound of rotor blades reached them after what felt like hours, but was probably less than 20 minutes. The rescue helicopter appeared over the ridge, a bright orange and white bird against the azure sky. Catherine felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by the realization that she might not survive the flight to the hospital. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Paramedics rappelled down from the helicopter, their boots hitting the trail with military precision. Catherine recognized the process from the other side. She'd received countless helicopter trauma patients in the emergency department. "What do we have?" the lead paramedic asked Robert as his partner began setting up equipment. "Adult female, approximately 30 years old, grizzly bear attack. Severe trauma to right upper extremity with obvious fractures and arterial bleeding, possible rib fractures, unknown internal injuries. She's been down for approximately 25 minutes. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, starting IV lines, administering pain medication, and stabilizing Catherine's shattered arm. The process was agonizing despite the morphine, and Catherine found herself crying out as they moved her onto the backboard. "I know it hurts," the female paramedic said gently. "We're going to get you to the hospital as fast as we can." As they loaded her into the helicopter, Catherine caught sight of the dead grizzly bear. Even in death, the animal was magnificent and terrifying. She understood now why indigenous peoples had considered bears sacred. They were power incarnate, the physical manifestation of the wilderness's indifference to human life. The flight to Anchorage was a nightmare of turbulence and pain. Despite the medication, every vibration of the helicopter sent shockwaves through Catherine's injured body. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes finding herself back on the trail, facing the charging bear, sometimes floating above the helicopter, watching her own broken body being rushed towards salvation. Dr. Sarah Chen was waiting in Trauma Bay 3 when the helicopter landed on the hospital's roof. Catherine had worked with Dr. Chen hundreds of times, but seeing her colleague's face from the patient's perspective was surreal and frightening. "Catherine," Dr. Chen's voice was professional, but Catherine could hear the underlying concern. "Can you hear me?" "It hurts," Catherine whispered, the first word she'd spoken since the helicopter pickup. "I know. We're going to take good care of you." The trauma team moved with the choreographed precision that Catherine had been part of so many times before. X-rays revealed the full extent of the damage. Multiple fractures to both bones in her right forearm, a dislocated shoulder, 3 broken ribs, and significant soft tissue damage. Miraculously, no major organs appeared to be damaged, though she would need immediate surgery to repair the arterial damage in her arm. Dr. Marcus Webb, the hospital's top orthopedic surgeon, examined the X-rays with a grim expression. "We're going to do everything we can to save the arm," he told Catherine as she was prepped for surgery. "But I have to be honest, the damage is extensive." Catherine nodded, understanding the subtext. She might lose her arm. Even if they could save it, she might never have full function again. Her career as a trauma nurse, which required fine motor skills and physical strength, might be over. The surgery lasted 8 hours. Dr. Webb and his team worked to repair the shattered bones, reattach severed muscles, and reconstruct the damaged blood vessels. When Catherine woke up in the ICU, her right arm was encased in a complex external fixator that looked like a medieval torture device. The next few days passed in a haze of pain medication and visitors. Her parents flew up from Portland, their faces etched with worry and barely contained anger at their daughter's choice to live in such a dangerous place. Her colleagues from the emergency department stopped by during their breaks, bringing flowers and get-well cards and carefully avoiding talking about the cases they were treating. Robert Henley, the hunting guide who had saved her life, visited on the 3rd day. He was uncomfortable in the hospital setting, turning his weathered baseball cap in his hands as he spoke. "I wanted to check on you," he said simply. "Make sure you were okay." "You saved my life," Catherine replied, her voice still weak from the medications. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Robert said. "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time. Been hunting these mountains for 30 years, and I've never seen a bear behave like that. Usually they want nothing to do with humans." The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had already been to interview Catherine about the attack. The investigating officer, a soft-spoken woman named Maria Santos, explained that they would be conducting a full investigation into the incident. "Bear attacks like this are extremely rare," Officer Santos had explained. "We need to understand what happened to prevent future incidents." The dead bear had been examined by wildlife biologists. They found that the animal was an adult male in poor physical condition, likely driven to desperation by hunger. Its stomach contained only pine needles and bark, clear evidence that it had been unable to find adequate food sources. Climate change and human encroachment into bear habitat were creating more situations where hungry bears encountered humans. Catherine's dog Bear had been recovered from the trail and buried in a pet cemetery outside Anchorage. The grief over losing her companion was almost as difficult to bear as the physical pain from her injuries. The media attention was intense and unwelcome. Catherine's story made national news as reporters descended on Anchorage to cover Alaska's latest bear attack. She refused all interview requests, wanting only to focus on her recovery and rehabilitation. Physical therapy began 2 weeks after the surgery. Catherine's right arm was weak and painful, the fingers barely able to grasp objects. The therapist, a cheerful woman named Linda, was optimistic but realistic about the challenges ahead. "You're going to get function back," Linda assured her. "But it's going to take time and a lot of hard work." Catherine threw herself into rehabilitation with the same determination that had made her a successful nurse. She spent hours each day working to regain strength and mobility in her damaged arm. The progress was frustratingly slow, but gradually she began to see improvement. 3 months after the attack, Catherine was cleared to return to work on light duty. Walking back into the emergency department for the first time was emotional. Her colleagues welcomed her with hugs and tears, and Catherine realized how much she had missed the controlled chaos of trauma medicine. But something had changed. The first time a trauma patient came in with animal injuries, a tourist who had been bitten by a moose, Catherine found herself frozen, unable to function. The sound of the patient's screams brought back vivid memories of her own encounter with the grizzly bear. Dr. Chen noticed her distress and quietly assigned her to less traumatic cases, but Catherine knew she couldn't continue this way indefinitely. She began seeing a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery, learning to process the psychological wounds that were proving more difficult to heal than the physical ones. The nightmares were the worst part. Nearly every night, Catherine found herself back on that trail, facing the charging bear with her broken dog at her feet. Sometimes she died in the dreams. Sometimes the bear spoke to her in a voice like grinding stone, asking why she had invaded its territory. Sometimes she became the bear, feeling its desperate hunger and rage. Sleep became something to avoid rather than seek. Catherine would lie awake for hours, listening to every creak and settling sound of her apartment, her fight-or-flight response triggered by the slightest noise. She kept bear spray by her bed, knowing it was irrational but unable to sleep without it. 6 months after the attack, Catherine made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She applied for a transfer to a hospital in the lower 48, specifically back to Portland, where she had grown up. Alaska, she realized, would always be the place where she nearly died. Every mountain peak would remind her of that morning on the trail. Her colleagues understood, but were sad to see her go. Dr. Chen spoke for many when she said, "You've been through something that would break most people. The fact that you're still standing, still wanting to help people, says everything about who you are." Robert Henley drove her to the airport on her last day in Alaska. They had become unlikely friends, bonded by the shared experience of those terrible moments on the trail. "You ever want to come back and face those mountains again?" he told her as she checked her bags. "You call me. We'll take it slow. Stay on the safe trails." Catherine smiled, though they both knew she would probably never take him up on the offer. "Maybe someday," she said, "when I'm ready." But as her plane lifted off from anchorage and she watched the Chugach Mountains disappear beneath the clouds, Catherine wondered if she would ever truly be ready to face the wilderness again. The bear had taken more than just the function in her arm. It had taken her sense of safety in the wild places that had once been her sanctuary. The physical scars would fade with time. The psychological ones, Catherine suspected, would last forever. But she was alive, and for now that was enough. Back in Portland, Catherine found work at OHSU Hospital and slowly began rebuilding her life. She avoided hiking trails, preferring city parks and paved paths where the only wildlife she might encounter were squirrels and songbirds. Her right arm would never be quite the same. She'd lost about 30% of her grip strength and still experienced pain during cold weather. But she had adapted, learning to work effectively despite the limitations. A year after the attack, Catherine received a package with no return address. Inside was a small carved wooden bear, beautifully crafted by someone with obvious skill. A note was tucked beneath it, written in careful handwriting. "Ms. Morgan, I carved this from a piece of wood that came from near where the attack happened. I thought you might want to have it. Not to remember the bad parts, but to remember that you survived something most people couldn't. You're stronger than you know. R. Henley." Catherine set the carved bear on her dresser, where it caught the morning light streaming through her bedroom window. It was beautiful and peaceful, nothing like the monster from her nightmares. Looking at it, she could almost remember what she had once loved about the wilderness. The sense of being part of something larger than herself, connected to the wild heart of the world. She wasn't ready to return to Alaska, might never be ready. But holding the small wooden bear, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year, the possibility that someday she might find her way back to the trails. Not the same person who had walked into the wilderness that morning, but someone stronger, someone who had faced her own mortality and lived to tell about it. The last trail had almost been her final trail. But Catherine Morgan was beginning to believe it didn't have to be her last trail forever. Outside her Portland apartment, the city hummed with traffic and human activity. But somewhere in the distance, Catherine could see the outline of Mount Hood against the evening sky. And for the first time since the attack, the sight of mountains didn't fill her with fear. It filled her with something else entirely: possibility. The bear in the wilderness had taught her that she was not the apex predator she had imagined herself to be. But it had also taught her that she was capable of surviving things she never thought possible. Both lessons she was learning were equally valuable. As night fell over Portland, Catherine placed the wooden bear back on her dresser and prepared for sleep. Tonight, she hoped, there would be no nightmares. Tonight, she might dream of peaceful trails and quiet forests where bears and humans could coexist in the careful balance that had existed for thousands of years before hunger and desperation changed the rules. The story of Catherine Morgan and the grizzly bear on the Powerline Pass Trail would become part of Alaska wilderness lore, a cautionary tale told in ranger stations and outdoor gear stores. But for Catherine herself, it was something more complex, an ending that was also a beginning, a trauma that had somehow become a transformation. She was no longer the same person who had set out that morning with her dog for what should have been a routine hike. She was someone who had looked into the face of wild death and lived to speak of it. That knowledge, terrible as it was, had become part of her strength. The last trail had ended at the moment when a grizzly bear charged out of the forest. But Catherine Morgan's story, she was beginning to realize, was just beginning.